Act 1. The Boy Forged in the Halls of the Gods. Chapter 1. The Night the All-Father Chose. There was a particular kind of silence that only existed in the mountains of Norway. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something vast and ancient holding its breath, the way the world itself might pause between heartbeats when it sensed that something of great consequence was about to occur. The pine trees stood like sentinels, dusted with fresh snow that glittered faintly under a sky so clear and so full of stars that a man could have wept simply from looking at it. Odin Allfather stood at the edge of the ridge and looked out across the sleeping valley below, his single eye calm, his raven-black cloak unmoved by the wind that should have whipped it into a frenzy. His two ravens, Hugin and Munin, perched on his shoulders with the comfortable familiarity of old companions, their feathers occasionally ruffling as they shifted their weight. He had seen 17,000 years of human civilization. He had drunk from the well of Mimir and sacrificed an eye so that nothing in the 9 realms could be hidden from his sight. He had walked among kings and beggars, had whispered wisdom into the ears of poets and warriors, had wept at the deaths of heroes whose names the world had long since forgotten. And yet here he stood, staring at a small bundle wrapped in ordinary cotton blankets that had been left, inexplicably, on a stone at the edge of his domain. He already knew, of course. He had known since the stars had shifted 3 nights ago in a pattern that his long experience recognized as the fingerprint of fate itself writing something new into the cosmos. He had walked to this ridge each of those 3 nights, waiting, watching, until tonight the waiting had ended. The bundle shifted. A pair of extraordinarily bright brown eyes opened and blinked against the cold air with an expression of curious alertness that was deeply unusual for an infant of no more than 3 or 4 months. Hugin, Odin said quietly. What do you make of him? The raven on his left shoulder leaned forward and studied the child with an intelligence that went far beyond any ordinary bird. Thought says he carries a mark I cannot name, Hugin replied, his voice like dry leaves scraping stone. Something sealed. Something dormant. Something that, if it were ever to wake fully, would shake the pillars of every realm. Munin? Memory says, the second raven murmured from his right shoulder, that the last time something was sealed away so carefully, it took 3 pantheons working in concert, and cost them all dearly. Whatever lives inside this child, Allfather, it was put there by a being of considerable power, and even more considerable fear. Odin said nothing for a long moment. The stars wheeled overhead. The snow lay undisturbed. The infant looked up at the old god with those impossibly alert brown eyes and made a small, unhurried sound that was neither distress nor laughter, but something in between. Something almost like recognition. Odin crouched down slowly until he was at eye level with the child, and he studied that small face with the thoroughness that a craftsman might give to an unfinished piece of work. Someone left you here deliberately, he said. Not to his ravens, but to the child himself. Not out of cruelty. Not out of negligence. They left you here because they wanted you found by something older than what hunts you. He paused. They were not wrong. He reached out one weathered hand, callous from 10,000 years of war and work, and let the infant grip his index finger. The grip was stronger than it had any right to be. Issei. The name had come with the child, written in Japanese on a small piece of paper tucked beneath the blankets, along with the date of birth and nothing else. No family name. No explanation. Just that one given name, as if whoever had left him knew that a name was the most important gift, and that everything else would follow in time. Odin straightened. He tucked the child against his chest with a practiced ease that might have surprised those who thought of the All-Father only as a god of war and wisdom. He had, after all, raised a great many children over the centuries. He knew how to hold one. Come then, Issei, he said, and turned back toward the ridge. There is a great deal you will need to learn, and we have already started late. The Hall of Asgard was not what most humans imagined. Valhalla, yes, was exactly as the legends described it, vast and golden and ringing with the laughter and clash of Einherjar warriors who feasted and fought from dawn to dusk in an endless cycle of glorious preparation. But Asgard itself, the heart of the realm, the place where the gods actually lived and argued and raised their families, was something quieter and stranger. It was a city built from architecture that did not entirely obey the rules of physics, where corridors opened onto landscapes that had no business being there, where the sky cycled through colors that Earth had no words for, where the smell of frost and lightning and green living things were always somehow present at the same time. It was here, into a room that was warm and lit by a fire that seemed to burn blue and gold simultaneously, that Odin carried the infant Issei. Frigga was already waiting. She was sitting in the high-backed chair beside the fire with the serenity of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that her husband's decisions were often surprising and always final, and she was looking at the door with an expression of patient expectation. When Odin entered with the child, she tilted her head slightly. "A child," she said. "The stars moved," Odin replied, as if this explained everything, which for Frigga it largely did. She rose and came to him, and he placed Issei gently into her arms without preamble. She held him with a naturalness born of centuries of motherhood. The child looked up at her with those alert brown eyes, and after a moment he smiled. It was the uncomplicated, wholehearted smile of an infant who has decided, based on some unfathomable internal calculus, that the person holding him is trustworthy. Frigga felt something in her chest settle like a stone finding its place at the bottom of a river. "He has been marked," Odin said. He was standing with his back to the fire now, his silhouette tall and shadowed. "Something lives within him that is not yet awake. We will need to be careful. We will need to be patient. And we will need to decide what kind of man we want him to be, because the kind of man he becomes will matter more than most people alive today can possibly comprehend. Then we raise him," Frigga said simply, "as our own. With the same love and the same expectations and the same truths. The other gods will have questions. Let them ask. We have answered harder questions than theirs." Odin looked at her for a long moment, and then something softened in the rigid architecture of his face. It was not a smile exactly, but it was the shape that his face made when he was content. "Agreed," he said. And so the boy who would one day be known as Issei Hyadu, Red Dragon Emperor, began his life not in a small house in Ko, Japan, with parents who barely noticed him, but in the golden halls of Asgard, held by the queen of the Norse gods, watched over by the All-Father himself, wrapped in the same firelight that had warmed the hands of heroes whose stories still shape the world. He fell asleep almost immediately. His grip on Frigga's finger was strong. Chapter 2: Growing Up Between Worlds. Childhood in Asgard was many things, but it was never boring. Issei grew from an infant who stared at everything with those wide, wondering eyes into a toddler who immediately attempted to touch everything those eyes landed on, which in Asgard meant that his early years were a constant negotiation between his boundless curiosity and the patience of the gods around him. He once tried to pull Mjolnir from the floor of Thor's armory at the age of 3. He had not moved it, naturally, but the effort had been so earnest and so committed that Thor had laughed for the better part of an hour. He grew into a child who was quick and loud and enormously fond of questions that had no easy answers. "Why does Hugin not speak to me?" Issei demanded one morning at the age of 6, standing in the courtyard of Odin's hall with his arms crossed in the particular way he had developed that indicated he felt a genuine injustice was being perpetrated against him. He was small for his age, with dark hair that stuck up in several directions simultaneously and brown eyes that catalogued the world with an intensity that sometimes made grown gods feel they were being studied. "Hugin speaks when he judges it worthwhile," Odin told him from his chair, not looking up from the texts he was reading. "He spoke to you this morning?" "I heard him. He said something about the eastern borderlands." "The eastern borderlands are his business." "What are my business, then?" Now Odin looked up. He studied the boy with that single eye that had seen everything, and Issei met his gaze without flinching, which was something that most adult beings never managed. The ravens on the old god's shoulders shifted. "Currently?" Odin said. "Your lessons. Your breakfast. And the apple tree you promised Frigga you would help prune." Issei made a face that was eloquently expressive of his feelings about apple trees. "After the pruning, though. After the pruning." The boy turned and ran back toward the garden at a speed that was, for his age and size, genuinely impressive. The ravens watched him go. "He will ask about his origins eventually," Munin said quietly. "He already has," Odin replied. 7 times in the last 2 years. Each time I tell him the truth, that someone left him where I could find him, that we do not know his family of birth, and that what matters is the family he has now. Each time he thinks about it for 3 days and then moves on to the next question. And when he is old enough to understand the full truth, then I will tell him the full truth. That is what I promised Frigga, and that is what I promised him, the night I brought him home, even if he was too young to understand the words. The gods of Asgard were not, as a rule, an uncomplicated family. Thor was the first one to truly take Issei under his wing, and this was partly because Thor had a generous heart that was constitutionally unable to resist someone who asked him earnest questions about lightning. Issei at 7 years old had asked him 17 consecutive questions about the nature of thunder, each one more technically specific than the last, until Thor had thrown his hands up in delighted exasperation and taken the boy out to the training fields to show him rather than tell him. The sight of the thunder god throwing small, controlled lightning bolts for an entranced 7-year-old had become one of the more frequently retold stories among the Einherjar. Sif took a different approach. She was a warrior first, and she recognized early that Issei had a physical aptitude that wanted direction. He was not the largest child, but he was coordinated in a way that went beyond ordinary human capability, and there was something in his movements even at 8 years old that suggested a body learning to reach for a potential it had not yet discovered. She began teaching him the basics of movement, how to fall without injury, how to read the weight of an opponent, how to be patient in a fight rather than throwing himself forward on instinct. He was not, she noted privately, a natural warrior in the way that some children were. He did not love violence. He did not find conflict exciting. What he loved was the challenge, the puzzle of it, the way each sparring session was a series of problems that required creative solutions. You think too much during a fight, she told him one afternoon when he was 9, after he had been knocked onto his back for the 5th time in a row by a training partner twice his size. Issei sat up and rubbed the back of his head with a theatrical grimace. Isn't thinking good? Not when thinking means you hesitate. There will be moments where you have 1/2 second to react. In those moments, your body needs to know what to do without asking your head for permission. He was quiet for a moment, considering this with the seriousness he brought to information he judged genuinely important. So I need to practice until my body thinks on its own. Exactly. And then when my body thinks on its own, I can use my head for the bigger problems. Sif looked at him. 9 years old, sitting in the dirt, completely undefeated in spirit despite being very thoroughly defeated in body. You are going to be an interesting problem someday, Issei. He grinned at her. It was the grin he had inherited from nobody, the grin that was entirely his own, wide and warm and slightly lopsided, the kind of grin that made you feel, irrationally, that everything was probably going to be fine. Loki was a more complicated figure. The god of mischief occupied a peculiar position in Issei's childhood. He was not straightforwardly kind, the way Thor was, or directly instructive, the way Sif was. He operated by indirection, by riddle, by the presentation of situations whose lessons only became apparent long after the situation itself had resolved. He was Odin's blood brother rather than Odin's son, which put him in a category of his own, present but peripheral, powerful but contained, always watching with those sharp green eyes as if assembling information for a purpose he had not yet chosen to reveal. When Issei was 10, Loki played a trick on him. It was not a cruel trick. Loki's cruelties, when they came, had a different texture. This was the kind of trick that Loki played on people he found genuinely interesting. He arranged for Issei to spend an entire day believing that a certain door in the hall of Asgard led to the training yard, when in fact it led, through a subtle rearrangement of space, somewhere else entirely every time Issei reached for the handle. By the end of the day, Issei had accidentally ended up in the library, the kitchen, the armory, Thor's personal quarters, briefly and embarrassingly, and the roof. He arrived at supper dusty, slightly bewildered, and carrying a sword that he had accidentally taken from the armory in his confusion, and when he saw Loki at the table he pointed at him immediately. That was you, was it? Loki asked, with the tone of a man who has spent several thousand years perfecting the art of not answering questions while appearing to answer them. What was the lesson? Because Issei had already, by 10 years old, figured out that when strange things happened around Loki there was always a lesson, even if it was a lesson you found infuriating. Loki tilted his head. Something shifted in his expression, something that was close to respect but that Loki would never describe as such. What do you think the lesson was? Issei thought about it. Don't assume that what worked yesterday will work today. Check your assumptions. The world changes and things that look the same can lead somewhere completely different. A pause. Also possibly that you find it funny when I end up places I didn't plan to be. Loki smiled. It was a real one, rare and sharp as a winter morning. Both are correct. The second one I will not deny. From that evening forward, Loki and Issei had an understanding. It was not warmth, precisely, not the warm, uncomplicated affection that existed between Issei and Thor. It was something more like mutual recognition, two people who understood that the world was more complicated than it appeared and who found this fact interesting rather than terrifying. Chapter 3, The Marking. The night of Issei's 12th birthday changed everything. It did not announce itself as a night of significance. The celebrations in Asgard were warm and noisy in the way that only a hall full of gods and warriors could be warm and noisy. Food that tasted of something older and richer than ordinary ingredients, mead that the Einherjar drank from cups the size of small buckets, stories told at a volume that could probably be heard in Midgard. Issei sat in the center of it all with the bemused joy of a boy who had grown up in the middle of exactly this kind of gathering and loved it unreservedly. It was after midnight when Frigga found him on the outer walkway. He had slipped out alone, which he did sometimes when the celebration became more than even his considerable social energy could sustain. He was sitting on the railing of the walkway with his legs hanging over the edge, looking out across the lights of Asgard spreading below him, with the world tree Yggdrasil visible in the far distance, its branches catching the starlight in ways that suggested depth beyond ordinary sight. Frigga sat beside him. She did not ask what he was thinking, because she had raised enough children to know when a child would tell you on their own schedule, and when pressing them would only delay the conversation. After a long while, Issei said, "Something is different tonight." Different how? I don't know. Like something is listening. Like something is aware that it's my birthday. He paused. Something that isn't any of you. Frigga was very still. How long have you felt this? Always, kind of. But tonight it's louder. He glanced at her sideways, and there was something in his expression that was older than 12, something that had been accumulating quietly for years. It's inside me, isn't it? Whatever it is. It's inside me. She did not answer immediately, and he did not push. This was a rhythm they had developed over 12 years. He would ask, she would consider, she would tell him the truth. Yes, she said finally. Since before we found you. And Allfather knows. Since the night he brought you home. What is it? Something of great power, Frigga said. She chose her words with the care of someone who understood that precision mattered more here than comfort. Something that was placed within you deliberately. What it is, precisely, even Odin cannot say with complete certainty. What he knows is that it is yours. It belongs to you, or it will, when the time comes for it to wake. Issei was quiet for a while. Below them, the lights of Asgard flickered warmly. The sound of celebration drifted up, distant and muffled, like music heard through walls. Should I be scared? No. You should be prepared. Frigga put her hand on his, briefly. That is what we have been doing, all of us, since you arrived. Preparing you. Not for what is inside you. For the person you need to be so that when it wakes, it finds someone worthy of it. He turned this over in his mind with the same methodical patience he brought to the difficult sparring problems Sif set him, and to the riddles Loki constructed, and to the passages Odin made him read from texts that were older than most civilizations. That's why the training is so intense, he said. And the history lessons. And the philosophy. Loki teaching me to think around corners. Yes. And you specifically, he said, looking at her with those honest brown eyes. You've been teaching me about people. How to read them. How to care about them without losing myself in caring about them. Frigga smiled. It was the smile she reserved for moments when one of her children proved that they had been listening more carefully than she realized. Yes. That too, Issei nodded slowly. Then, with the absolute lack of self-consciousness that was one of his most consistent characteristics, he leaned sideways and rested his head briefly on her shoulder. Okay, he said. Then I'm not scared. 3 nights later, it happened. Issei woke at precisely 3 in the morning with the feeling that someone had struck a bell inside his chest. Not painful. Not frightening. But enormous, resonant, unavoidable, the way a sound can be too large for a room and fill it completely from wall to wall. He sat up in his bed in the room that Frigga had decorated 12 years ago with the quiet confidence of someone making a permanent choice, and he looked at his right hand. On the back of it, barely visible in the low light, there was a faint mark. He held it closer to the small lamp beside his bed and studied it. It looked, in this light, like a scale. Like the scale of something immense and ancient, pressed into his skin from the inside. It faded almost immediately. As if it had shown itself once, announced its presence, and then decided that once was enough for now. Issei stayed very still for a long moment. Then he got up, wrapped himself in the heavy blanket that Frigga had made him 2 winters ago, walked down the corridor to the room where Odin spent most of his nights reading, knocked twice, and waited. The door opened. Odin looked at him. Then at his right hand, even though the mark was no longer visible. "Come in," Odin said. They sat across from each other in the firelit room, the old god and the boy, and Odin told him. He told him about the 2 heavenly dragons, Ddraig and Albion, beings whose power was so vast that the other supernatural factions of the world had spent centuries being grateful that they were sealed rather than active. He told him about the Longinus, the 13 sacred gears of enormous power. He told him, carefully and precisely, that inside Issei's left arm lived one of the most powerful of those gears, the boosted gear, the gauntlet of the Red Dragon Emperor, and that it had been passed down through a line of hosts who had, without exception, burned brilliantly and briefly like stars falling from the sky. He told him that the mark tonight meant the gear was beginning, very slowly, to stir. Issei listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual for him. His face went through several expressions: surprise, then the focused look he wore when cataloging important information, then something quieter and harder to read. When Odin finished, Issei looked at his right hand again, even though the mark was not there to see. "The other hosts," he said? "You said they burned brightly and briefly." "Yes. Because they didn't know how to manage it. Because the power overwhelmed them. In most cases, yes. That's why you've spent 12 years training me. Not just so I can fight. So I can carry this without it carrying me." Odin looked at the boy across the firelight and felt something that the Allfather rarely felt, the specific satisfaction of a plan that was unfolding exactly as it should, combined with the deeper, more genuine satisfaction of watching someone you cared for demonstrate exactly why you had believed in them. "Yes," he said. Issei was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the eternal Asgardian sky cycled through its colors. A log shifted in the fire. "Allfather." He used the formal title when he was being serious, the same way he used Frigga's name directly when he wanted her to know he was speaking from the center of himself rather than from the surface. "I'm going to do this right. Whatever this thing inside me is, whatever it wants, whatever it might become. I'm going to do it right. I promise." It was a promise made by a 12-year-old boy in the middle of the night, in a firelit room. It was also, as Hugin and Munin had heard 3,000 years of prophecy attest, the kind of promise that shaped the course of everything that came after. Odin inclined his head. "I know," he said. Chapter 4. Lessons of the 9 Realms. The years between 12 and 16 were a different kind of education. Before the revelation about the boosted gear, Issei's training had been broad history, philosophy, combat fundamentals, the study of different cultures and power systems, language. Afterward, it became more deliberate. Not more urgent, Odin was careful about that, insisting that urgency was the enemy of mastery. But more directed. As if the pieces that had been assembling themselves into a foundation were now beginning to reach towards something specific. Odin himself took on more of his education directly. They began to travel together. Not to Midgard, not yet, but through the other realms. To Alfheim, the realm of light, where Issei learned that beauty could be a form of power, and that there were kinds of strength that had nothing to do with combat. To Nidavellir, where the dwarves lived and worked, and where Issei spent 3 weeks watching master craftsmen and absorbing the philosophy that the most powerful things were the things built with the most care. To the edges of Niflheim, not the frozen interior, but the border regions, where the cold was so absolute that it clarified the mind to diamond-like sharpness, and the lessons Odin chose for those locations were always about endurance and the nature of will. Why endurance? Issei asked during one of those sessions, sitting wrapped in 7 layers of wool and leather while Odin sat beside him in his cloak as if the temperature were irrelevant, which for Odin it largely was. You and Sif both come back to endurance. Not just physical endurance. Something else. The boosted gear doubles your power at regular intervals, Odin said. This is its most famous feature. What most people do not consider is what happens to the body and mind of the host during this process. Power is not neutral. It is not simply a resource you hold the way you might hold a stone. It presses against you. It demands response. The hosts who were broken by their gears were not broken because the power was too great. They were broken because they had no self to return to when the power receded. Issei turned this over. The cold made thinking sharp. They lost themselves in it. They never had a strong enough sense of themselves to begin with. The gear is a mirror, in some ways. It reflects and amplifies what is already there. If what is there is solid and deep and genuine, then what is reflected is solid and deep and genuine. If what is there is shallow or frightened or hungry for validation from outside itself, then what is reflected is those things, made enormous. So endurance isn't about withstanding pain. Endurance, Odin said, is about knowing who you are and refusing to be argued out of it, by fear, by pressure, by temptation, by power itself. Issei sat with this for a long moment. The cold wind moved over the border of Niflheim with a sound like a very distant ocean. Who am I then? That is the only question worth spending a life answering. What do you think so far? Issei thought about it with genuine care. I think I'm someone who likes people, he said at last. Not abstractly. Specifically. I like specific people for specific reasons. I like that they're all different, and that you can't predict them perfectly. I like the way Thor laughs. I like the way Sif gets this particular look when I do something she didn't expect. I like the way Frigga knows when I need her to talk, and when I need her to just be there. A pause. I think caring about specific people is probably the most important thing I do. Odin studied him for a long moment. And what does that tell you about who you are? That I'm someone who belongs to the people he cares about. Not in a weak way, in the way that a tree belongs to the earth it grows from. He frowned slightly. That probably sounds strange. It sounds exactly right, Odin said. That is the Allfather's assessment, for whatever it is worth to you. It was worth a great deal, though Issei was characteristically subtle about showing it, which mainly manifested as him being slightly quieter than usual for the rest of the afternoon. Thor began teaching him combat in earnest at 14, not the fundamentals, which Sif had covered. The deeper things, what it meant to fight in defense of something rather than in pursuit of something. How the intent behind a battle changed the texture of the battle itself. How a warrior who was fighting for a reason was different from a warrior who was fighting from anger, and why the former almost always prevailed over the latter in engagements that lasted long enough for the difference to matter. You can't use Mjolnir, Thor told him cheerfully one afternoon, after Issei had made another attempt. Nobody expected. But you've something more interesting. What? You learn from every single fight. Every single one. I have trained warriors for 800 years and I have never seen anything like it. Most warriors, you beat them, they understand it intellectually, they make small adjustments. You. Every time you hit the ground you come up having understood something new, something structural, and the next exchange is completely different. Thor shook his head in something that was genuinely close to awe. Whatever lives inside you, Issei, I think it is not just strength. I think it watches. I think it learns alongside you. Issei looked at his left hand. The mark was still only visible at certain times and in certain lights. But he was aware of it now with a constant low-level awareness, the way you became aware of your heartbeat once someone pointed it out. Is that good or frightening? He asked. In my experience? Thor grinned, broad and uncomplicated. Both. But mostly good. The frightening part just means it matters. The conversation about Midgard happened when Issei was 15. He had known it was coming. He was half human, after all, or fully human biologically if the reports Odin had gathered were accurate, which they generally were. There was a human world out there that he had visited only in fragments, that he knew about primarily through texts and through the stories of Einherjar who had lived human lives before dying and arriving in Valhalla. He had always understood, on some level, that his path would eventually lead there. Still, when Odin sat him down and explained that at 16 he would be enrolled in a human school in Japan, that the supernatural world of that country was particular and complex and had its own dangers and its own factions, and that Issei's presence there was something that fate had apparently decided regardless of what anyone else thought about it, the reality of it was different from the understanding of it. Japan, Issei said, it is where you are from. It is where certain events are going to occur regardless of where you are physically located, because fate, as I have observed over 17,000 years, has very little patience for attempts to reroute it. What kind of events? Events that will involve the boosted gear. Events that will involve the factions that govern the supernatural world, the devils, the fallen angels, the various independent powers. Events that will, if my reading of the pattern is correct, require exactly the kind of person you are becoming. Issei thought about it. Thought about the training, the philosophy, the years of deliberate preparation. Thought about what Frigga had said the night of his birthday, preparing you for the person you need to be. And I'll go alone? You will attend school as a human student. You will live as a human teenager. You will face what comes as yourself, using what you have been given and what you have learned. A pause. You will not be unwatched. You will not be unprotected. But the choices will be yours to make. Because if you protected me from all of it, whatever it built wouldn't be mine, Issei said. Not resentfully. Just accurately. Yes. Issei was quiet for a moment. Then, is Ko a nice place? Odin blinked, which for Odin was the equivalent of a double take. I have not assessed it for pleasantness. I'll find out myself then. Issei stood up and stretched, with the easy physicality of someone whose body had been trained for 4 years to move with precision and power. He was taller now, broader through the shoulders, still with that dark hair and those direct brown eyes. The boy who had arrived as an infant was becoming someone else, not less himself, but more himself, like a figure coming into sharper focus. Can I ask a favor? You may ask. Before I go. One more trip with you. Somewhere you think I need to see. Odin considered this for a long moment. Then, the world tree, he said. At dawn. It is past time you understood what connects everything to everything else. Issei nodded. Tomorrow, then. He walked out of the room with his hands in his pockets and an expression that was balanced somewhere exactly between nervous and ready, which was, Odin reflected, exactly the right expression for a person standing at the edge of the next great chapter of their life. Chapter 5, The Edge of Yggdrasil. The world tree was not a tree. It was not a tree in any sense that the word implied, something rooted, stationary, contained within the logic of growth and bark and leaf. Yggdrasil was something for which human language did not have an adequate term, and perhaps never could, because it was in some sense the condition under which everything else existed. The 9 realms were not on the tree or in the tree. They were organized by the tree, held in their relationships to each other by the vast and incomprehensible architecture of something that was simultaneously the most alive thing in existence, and the most ancient structure in the cosmos. Standing at its roots at dawn, Issei felt very small. He had been small many times in his life. Asgard was not a place that allowed you to forget your own scale. But this was different. This was not the smallness of standing beside a very large thing. This was the smallness of understanding, in your actual bones rather than just your mind, that the universe was larger than any individual perspective could contain. Most beings who come here, Odin said beside him, spend the entire time attempting to comprehend its size. The size is not the point. What is the point? Look at the roots. Issei looked at the roots. They were vast, certainly, larger than mountains, running off in directions that implied spatial dimensions that ordinary geometry did not account for. But as he looked, actually looked, he began to see something that he had missed in his initial overwhelm. Everything was connected to everything else. Not in a simple linear way, not cause and effect, not one root feeding into another in a straightforward direction. It was more complex than that, and more elegant. Every point of connection was also a branching. Every root that disappeared into the dark earth re-emerged in 3 different places as something subtly changed. Nothing, anywhere along the entire impossible length of it, was truly isolated. Nothing existed at a remove from everything else. Fate works the same way, Odin said. Every action is a root that feeds something you cannot see from where you are standing. Every connection you make, every choice, every moment of genuine care or genuine courage, becomes part of the structure that holds everything else. That sounds like a lot of pressure, Issei said. It sounds like importance. The two are related but not identical. Issei stood there for a long time in the early dawn light, watching the way the light moved through the roots of the world tree, and he let himself feel the size of what was ahead of him without trying to reduce it or manage it or wrap it in something more comfortable. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the things worth doing were usually the things that felt largest. After a while, he said, I'm going to meet people in Ko who matter. I can feel it. Not the gear thing, not prophecy. Just. I know that people I'm going to care about are there. Yes, Odin said. And things are going to get complicated. Considerably. And I'm going to have to be the person you've spent 16 years making me into. The person you have spent 16 years making yourself into, Odin corrected, with a gentleness that he reserved for truths he considered important enough to repeat until they took hold. I provided conditions. You built the person. Issei looked at him. Odin looked back. Between them, the roots of the world tree moved in a light that came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Thank you, Issei said. Not for the specific thing. For everything. For the stone at the edge of the ridge. For the room with the blue-gold fire. For the ravens and the sparring and the cold of Niflheim, and the 3 weeks with the dwarves and every conversation that had started before dawn and ended somewhere unexpected. Odin put a hand on his shoulder. It was not a small gesture, from a being who expressed himself most often through word and action rather than touch. You have been a credit to this family, Issei. Whatever happens next. Whatever you face. Remember that. Issei nodded. He turned back to look at the world tree one more time, fixing it in his memory with the particular care he took with things he knew he would need to return to when everything became difficult. Then he turned away from it, squaring his shoulders, and began the walk back toward the hall, toward tomorrow, toward Ko, toward whatever the world tree's roots had already, long before this morning, decided was waiting for him there. On the night before he left, Frigga sat with him for a long time without speaking. They were in the garden, the one she had tended for as long as Issei could remember, where the flowers grew in colors that did not exist in ordinary spectrums, and the air smelled of something that was not quite any earthly flower but that Issei had always associated, without being able to explain why, with the feeling of being home. She had given him 3 things. The first was a small pendant, unremarkable to look at, carved from a piece of Yggdrasil root no larger than his thumbnail, that she had worn as part of a bracelet for longer than most civilizations had existed. Not for protection, she said. It carries no magic. It is simply something of mine for you to carry. So that wherever you are, part of where you come from is with you. The second was a piece of advice. The people you are going to meet have been living in a world that tells them their worth is determined by their power and their faction and their bloodline. You will be, in most of their eyes, an anomaly they cannot categorize. Be patient with that. The categories that feel most certain are usually the ones built around the most fear. The third was a hug. Long and unhurried, the way Frigga did everything, with her whole attention and none of the self-consciousness that humans sometimes brought to displays of affection. Issei returned it with the complete lack of embarrassment of someone who had been raised in a family that understood that caring for people was strength rather than weakness. Come back with stories, she said when they separated. Good ones and hard ones both. I will. He did not sleep much that night. Not from anxiety, or not primarily from anxiety. More from the quality of attention he wanted to give to the last night of one chapter, and the first night of the next. He lay in his room in the hall of Asgard and looked at the ceiling and thought about roots and connections and the way the world tree moved in the dawn light, and he thought about the mark on his left arm that occasionally made itself known with a warmth that was not quite physical, and he thought about a city called Ko that he had never seen but that somehow felt, in some unnameable way, like a place that had been waiting for him specifically. When morning came, he was ready. He picked up the bag that Sif had helped him pack, practical and efficient down to the last item, and he walked out of the room, and down the corridor, and through the great doors of the hall, and into a world that was about to become considerably more complicated. Hugin and Munin watched him go from their perch above the doorway. Well, said Hugin. Indeed, said Munin. Above the hall of Asgard, the sky turned from night to day with the slow grandeur of a world that had been doing this for longer than anyone alive could remember, and that intended to keep doing it for longer than anyone alive could imagine. The light came across the golden rooftops and the wide courtyards and fell, finally, on the path that led away from the hall and toward the bridge and toward everything that came next. The path was empty now. The boy was already on his way. Act 2. The City Between Worlds. Chapter 6. First Steps in Ko. Ko was a city that did not know what it was. That was Issei's first impression, stepping off the train on a morning in early April with the cherry blossoms doing their brief and extravagant work on every street corner, petals spiraling down in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The city was beautiful in the particular way that places are beautiful when they have been inhabited long enough to acquire a texture, when the buildings and streets and parks have absorbed enough human experience to feel present in a way that goes beyond their physical dimensions. But underneath that beauty there was something else. Something that most of the city's human population moved through without noticing, the way you might walk across a bridge every day without thinking about the river below. Issei noticed it immediately. He had been raised by gods in a realm where the supernatural was the ordinary, and the particular quality of energy that ran through Ko like water through hidden pipes was, to his awareness, as obvious as neon. 2 factions, he had been told. 2 devil clans, the Gremri and the Citri, who had chosen this city as a territory for reasons that were partly strategic and partly, he suspected, because it was genuinely pleasant. They maintained it carefully, suppressing large-scale supernatural activity, keeping the human population comfortable and oblivious. It was, as far as devil territorial management went, apparently considered exemplary. Issei stood at the station exit and breathed in the April air and let himself simply exist in the city for a moment before he did anything else. This was something Odin had taught him. Arrive somewhere, and before you act, before you plan, before you assess, simply be there. Let the place arrive in you as much as you arrive in it. Ko arrived in him as cherry blossoms, the distant sound of a school bell, the feeling of something very old watching from just below the surface of things, and the irrational but persistent sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He picked up his bag and walked toward the apartment that had been arranged for him. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 3 streets from Ko Academy, small and clean with windows that looked out over a narrow street where a bakery operated on the ground floor, and the smell of fresh bread drifted up in the mornings with the reliability of a natural phenomenon. It had been furnished in advance, practically and without fuss, in a way that suggested someone who had very specific ideas about what a young man needed: a good desk, a good bed, bookshelves already stocked with a selection that would have baffled any ordinary teenager but that Issei moved through with easy familiarity, pausing to straighten a volume of Norse cosmological texts that had been shelved slightly askew. There was a note on the kitchen table in Odin's handwriting, which was precise and archaic and somehow communicated the author's personality entirely through the specific angles of its letters. It read, "The school registers you as a transfer student. Your documents are in the drawer. Do not provoke the devils unnecessarily. Remember what you are. Come home with good stories." And then, below that, in different handwriting, rounded and warm, "There is food in the refrigerator. I packed the soup you like. Be warm. Be careful. Be yourself. F." Issei stood in the small kitchen holding the note for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to the pendant Frigga had given him, and he went to put the kettle on. Ko Academy was, academically, roughly at the level Issei had expected based on Odin's assessment of the Japanese secondary education system, which was to say that it was rigorous by human standards and manageable by the standards of someone who had been educated by the All-Father. The social landscape was considerably more interesting. He arrived on his first morning having navigated the uniform situation, dark jacket and trousers, standard issue, with the slightly self-conscious awareness of someone who had spent most of his life in clothing that did not have a prescribed institutional look, and he was directed by a helpful administrative staff member to the first-year classroom where he would spend most of his time. The classroom was full of the particular low-level noise of a group of 16 and 17-year-olds who had not yet decided whether the presence of a new student was exciting or irrelevant. Issei stood at the front and looked out at it all with a composure that was genuine rather than performed, because he had been looked at by beings considerably more intimidating than a roomful of Japanese high school students, and he introduced himself simply. Issei Hayadu. Transfer student. I've been living abroad. Happy to be here. 3 things happened in rapid succession. A boy near the back of the room, round-faced and immediately friendly-looking, gave him a thumbs up with the enthusiasm of someone who had already decided they were going to be friends, and was simply waiting for the formality of the introduction to conclude. His name, Issei would learn in approximately 4 minutes, was Matsuda, and he operated under the philosophically interesting assumption that anyone who was not already his friend simply had not had the opportunity to become so yet. A boy beside him, sharper-featured and with an expression that was more guarded but equally curious, nodded in a way that managed to convey both skepticism and openness simultaneously. This was Motohama, who would turn out to have a memory that catalogued everything it encountered and an opinion about everything it catalogued. And in the front row, a girl turned from where she had been already reading a book and gave him the kind of look that meant she had gathered more information in 3 seconds than most people would assemble in 3 hours. Issei met her eyes. She looked away first, which surprised him slightly, and went back to her book. He filed all 3 observations away with the automatic precision that Sif's years of training had installed in him. Not suspicious precision, just awareness, the way you learn to track everything in your environment not because you expected danger but because understanding your surroundings was simply good practice. He found his seat and settled into it, and Co-Academy began. Chapter 7 Matsuda, Motohama, and the Question of Normal. By the end of the first day, Issei had 2 friends. This was not, in itself, unusual. Issei had always found it relatively easy to connect with people, a tendency that Frigga attributed to genuine interest and Loki attributed to the specific charisma of someone who was not performing likability, but simply experiencing it. What was unusual, or what felt unusual to him, was the texture of these particular connections. Matsuda was cheerful in a way that was completely uncomplicated, the way sunlight was cheerful, without agenda or anxiety or the subtle self-awareness that more guarded people brought to their warmth. He talked the way some people walked, as if the act itself were its own justification, and he had an ability to find enthusiasm in the most mundane circumstances that Issei found genuinely charming. Within 20 minutes of meeting, Matsuda had explained to him the precise ranking of every ramen shop within cycling distance of the school, the ongoing situation regarding the school's equipment room that he described with hushed gravity as a tragedy of bureaucratic proportion, and his assessment of Issei's hair, which he declared was chaotic but not bad. Motohama was different. He operated at a slightly lower volume but with considerably more density. He asked questions the way certain animals hunted, patient, methodical, assembling information in a way that did not announce itself as assembling but definitely was. He asked Issei where he had been living abroad, and when Issei said Norway, he asked 3 specific follow-up questions about Norway that most people would not have thought to ask, and then nodded as if the answers had confirmed something he had suspected. "You're different," Motohama said during lunch, while Matsuda was engaged in an intense negotiation with a vending machine that was, according to him, being unreasonably uncooperative. "Different how?" Issei asked, because he was curious rather than defensive. "Not nervous. Most transfer students are nervous. Even the ones who seem confident are nervous underneath. You're not. Should I be?" Motohama considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Socially, no. You're going to be fine. You're easy to talk to and you actually listen when people speak, which is rarer than it should be." A pause. "Whatever you've been doing in Norway, it gave you something." "I don't know what it is yet." Issei looked at him with genuine appreciation. "You're going to figure it out, aren't you? Eventually. That's fair. I'll be interested to see what conclusion you reach." Motohama gave him a look that was, Issei thought, the specific look of someone recalibrating their initial assessment of a person upward. It was a look he recognized because Sif had given him a version of it during their early sparring sessions, the moment she realized that the new kid was actually paying attention. Matsuda returned from his struggle with the vending machine in triumph, holding a can of coffee above his head like a trophy. Victory, he announced, was achieved. The machine blinked first. Issei, do you drink coffee? Tea mostly. That's respectable. Motohama drinks tea. I've been trying to convert him for 2 years. Maybe having 2 tea people will make me feel surrounded. Or outnumbered, Motohama said. Surrounded is a more interesting word, Matsuda replied, dropping into his seat with the comfortable certainty of someone who had already decided this lunch period was going well. So Issei. Norway. What's that like? And Issei, who had spent considerable time thinking about how to answer questions about his background in ways that were true without being impossible, settled into the version of his story that he and Odin had constructed together over the previous year. The son of Japanese parents who had worked abroad, raised in a quiet community in the Norwegian mountains, returned to Japan for high school to reconnect with his heritage. It was a story with enough texture to hold up to curiosity, and enough simplicity that it did not invite the kind of specific interrogation that the actual truth would have. He told it well, because he had been taught by Loki what a good story required, which was not elaborate detail but emotional truth. The emotional truth in this case was genuine. He had been raised somewhere extraordinary by people he loved and was now somewhere new, and that was as real as anything he could have said. Matsuda listened with his full attention in the way he gave everything his full attention. Motohama listened with that assembling quality, tracking the shape of the story as much as its content. When Issei finished, Matsuda nodded sagely and said, "Mountain kid?" That explains the composure. Mountain kids are always calm. It's the altitude. That is not how altitude works, Motohama said. It is absolutely how altitude works. Issei laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came without preparation. The lunch period ended, and the 3 of them walked back to class together, and the small, unremarkable machinery of friendship, which was one of the most important kinds of machinery in any world, began to run. The supernatural pressure in Ko was not subtle, once you knew how to feel for it. Issei had been raised in the presence of divine energy since infancy. He had sat in the same room as Odin, who radiated something so immense and ancient that sensitive mortals had been known to feel it as a change in air pressure. He had sparred with Thor, whose divine energy manifested as a literal charge in the atmosphere. He had learned to feel the texture of supernatural presence the way a musician learns to hear individual instruments in an orchestra. Ko had 2 very strong signatures and approximately a dozen smaller ones scattered across the school campus, and the 2 strong ones were in the old school building, the one connected to the main building by a covered walkway that the students avoided by unspoken collective agreement without being able to explain why. Devils. He was fairly certain. The signature of devil energy was different from the Aesir energy he had grown up with, less ancient in the specific way that the Norse gods were ancient, but deep in its own right, and unmistakable once you had been told what to look for. He did not go to the old building. Not on his first day. He walked past the covered walkway between classes and felt the energy of whatever was on the other end of it, and noted it with the same careful, neutral attention he gave to everything he was not yet ready to engage with. He would, eventually. He knew that. The roots of the world tree did not arrange things so carefully only to have them fail to connect. But first, he had algebra. He went to algebra. Chapter 8, The Girl with Crimson Hair. He saw her for the first time on the 5th day. It was not a dramatic encounter. There was no accident, no collision, no orchestrated moment of fate announcing itself with cinematic flourish. He was walking across the school courtyard in the early morning before classes, a habit he had developed because the courtyard was quiet at that hour, and the light was good, and it was the kind of morning that rewarded being awake for it, when he became aware that someone else was already there. She was standing at the far end of the courtyard near the garden wall where someone had, years ago, planted a wisteria that had since grown ambitious and sprawled in a way that was both slightly unruly and extremely beautiful. She was not doing anything in particular. She was simply standing, her back mostly to him, her crimson hair catching the morning light in a way that made it look like something warmer and more extraordinary than hair had any business looking. She was tall, with a posture that suggested she had been raised to be comfortable with the space she occupied. She was in the school uniform, but wearing it with the particular ease of someone for whom authority is not a performance because it is simply the natural condition of things. Even from across the courtyard, there was something in her presence that announced itself, not loudly, not as a demand, but the way a mountain announces itself in a landscape by simply being larger than everything around it. He was about to continue on his way, because staring was rude and he had been raised by people who took manners seriously, when she turned. He had expected, based on the rest of her, that her face would be equally composed. What he had not expected was that she would look, in the first unguarded moment of turning and finding someone there, briefly surprised. Not alarmed. Surprised. As if the morning had presented her with something she had not anticipated, and she had not yet decided how to receive it. Their eyes met across the courtyard. She had blue-green eyes that were, he noted with the objectivity of someone making a genuine observation rather than a compliment, extraordinary. Not because of their color, though the color was unusual. Because of what was in them, intelligence, certainly, and a quality of attention that he recognized because he had grown up around beings who paid very specific kinds of attention to everything, but also, unexpectedly, something that looked like loneliness wearing the clothes of composure. He nodded at her, the simple acknowledgement of one person to another sharing a quiet morning. It was not a bid for conversation. It was simply the appropriate recognition of another presence. She looked at him for one moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded back, precise and unhurried, and turned and walked toward the school building. Issei watched her go for the 3 seconds it took to process what he had just observed, and then he looked back at the wisteria, which was doing nothing differently than it had been doing before, and which he nonetheless found he was seeing somewhat more vividly. He did not know her name yet. He did not know anything about her except what he had assembled in 30 seconds of observation. But he had been trained by the best observers in 9 realms, and 30 seconds of observation had told him a number of things, the most important of which was that this was a person worth knowing. Her name was Rias Gremry. He learned this from Matsuda, who delivered the information with the reverent tone usually reserved for significant religious figures. Rias Gremry, Matsuda said in the way he said things he considered profound. They were eating lunch in the courtyard, and he had noticed Issei glancing toward the school building with the specific quality of attention that Motohama had immediately identified and filed for later analysis. 3rd year. President of the Occult Research Club. Probably the most beautiful person at this school and possibly the most beautiful person in Ko, which I say as a statement of objective fact rather than personal bias. She's also considerably out of your reach, Motohama said, not unkindly. Out of most people's reach. Not unfriendly, but she exists at a social altitude that makes casual interaction feel like an expedition. Who's in the Occult Research Club? Issei asked, because this was the more interesting question. Both of them looked at him with the particular look of people who have realized that a conversation has taken a slightly unexpected turn. Why? Matsuda asked. Curious. What do they actually do? Nobody knows exactly, Motohama said. They're in the old building. The club meets, apparently, but it's not open to general membership. There are a few other members, upper years mostly. Akino Himejima, who is the vice president and who is, I will note for the record, equally extraordinary in a different direction. He adjusted his glasses in the way he did when organizing information for presentation. There's also a first year, Kaneko Tuju, who sits in the back of the classroom 2 rows from you and who has never, to my knowledge, spoken at a volume above a murmur. Issei knew who Kaneko Tuju was. She was the girl in the front row on his first day who had looked at him, and then looked away, and she was one of the smaller supernatural signatures he had noted in the school. Small but unusual. A texture he had not quite identified yet. Interesting, he said, and returned to his lunch, and let the conversation move on in the direction Matsuda was already steering it, which was toward the afternoon's physical education class and whether the equipment room situation had been resolved. It had not been resolved. This appeared to be a continuing narrative in Matsuda's life. The second time he saw Rias Gremry, they actually spoke. It was in the library, 3 days after the courtyard morning, which he had not engineered and which he suspected she had not either, because the library at 7 in the evening was not a location that invited social orchestration. It was simply where you went when you needed a particular book, and the school library had it. He was looking for a reference text on classical Japanese history, which had been assigned by his history teacher, and which he had been unable to find in the school's main catalog system, when he turned a corner between shelves and nearly walked directly into her. She was carrying 3 books and looked, for the second time, briefly surprised to find him there. He stepped back to give her room, and the books did not fall, which they might have if either of them had been slightly less coordinated. "Sorry," he said. And then, because he was who he was and this was the most natural thing to do, "Are you all right?" She looked at him with those extraordinary eyes. Up close the intelligence in them was even more evident, and so was that quality he had identified from across the courtyard, the loneliness wearing composure like a well-made coat. "Fine," she said. Her voice was low and clear, the voice of someone who had learned that you did not need to raise your voice to be heard. "You are the transfer student?" Hayate Issei. "Yes." "And you are Grimora-senpai?" Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a kind of recalibration. "You know my name. It's a small school. You have a fairly significant presence in it." A pause. Something in the corner of her mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was the architectural precursor to one. "That is a diplomatic way of saying that people talk about me. People talk about anyone they find interesting," he said. "That's not a criticism of them or of you. It's just what people do with remarkable things." The pause this time was longer. She was looking at him with the specific quality of attention of someone who is not accustomed to being spoken to in a particular way, and is deciding how they feel about it. "You are looking for something," she said finally, which he recognized as a change of subject, executed smoothly. "The Suzuki reference on Heian period court culture. The catalog says it's here, but I cannot locate it." She reached past him, to a shelf approximately at eye level, and removed a book with the practiced ease of someone who knew this library well. She handed it to him. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it simply, because he was not a person who deployed gratitude as social currency but as an actual expression of what he felt. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded, gathered her 3 books against her chest, and walked back toward the reading tables. He found a table near the window and sat down, and opened the Suzuki reference. The evening light came through the library windows at an angle that made the dust motes visible, moving in slow patterns above the reading tables. Across the room, Rias Gremry opened one of her books and began to read, and the library settled around both of them into the particular piece of a place where people are doing what they came to do. Neither of them said anything else. It was, somehow, not a silence that needed to be filled. Chapter 9. The Occult Research Club. It was Kaneko Tuju who spoke to him first. This was, according to Matsuda, essentially unprecedented. Kaneko Tuju, first year, white-haired, cat-haired in the sense of the small ornamental clips she sometimes wore rather than in any literal sense, though Issei, having been raised in a world where the literal was frequently more interesting than the metaphorical, kept an open mind, spoke to approximately nobody who was not already known to her. She moved through the school like a very small weather system, present, observable, and not particularly interested in interaction. She appeared beside him at his locker on a Tuesday morning with no preamble, which he was beginning to think might be her signature style. "You felt it," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her golden eyes were direct and unblinking in the way that belonged to creatures who assess the world very carefully and very quickly, and then said exactly what their assessment produced. "What did I feel?" he asked, because he wanted to know which specific thing she meant. "The old building. You walked past it last week, and you stopped for half a second. Most people don't stop. Most people feel something and their minds reroute them before they can acknowledge what they felt. You stopped, and then you chose to keep walking. That's different." He closed his locker and looked at her with the same directness. She was perhaps the most compact person he had ever encountered, and she occupied her own space with the solid, unhurried quality of something that had no particular need to announce itself. You were watching, he said. I watch things. That's what I do. Fair. He leaned against the locker. Yes. I felt it. I have been feeling it since I arrived. 2 primary signatures in the old building and a number of smaller ones distributed through the campus. He met her eyes. Including yours. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. She was very still, the way small, precise things were still when they were processing information that had changed the parameters of a situation. What are you? She said. It was not quite a question, not quite a demand. It was the honest request of someone who had encountered something they had not categorized and needed the category before they could decide what to do next. Human, he said. As far as I know. But I have been raised by people who are not. So my sense of what is normal is fairly calibrated. Another pause. Then, you should come to the club. The Occult Research Club. Yes. When? Today. After school. Old building, 2nd floor. She looked at him for one more moment with those unblinking golden eyes. Bring yourself. Don't bring anyone else. Then she turned and walked away with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who had said exactly what they came to say and had no interest in adding to it. Issei looked after her for a moment. Then he smiled, the warm lopsided smile that was entirely his, and went to class. The old building had a different quality of air. Not unpleasant, not threatening, but unmistakably different. The way the air in Odin's study had a different quality from the rest of the hall, denser somehow, weighted with the accumulated presence of things that thought in deep and complicated patterns. Issei walked up the stairs to the 2nd floor with his hands in his pockets, and the Frigga pendant warm against his chest, and the mark on his left arm doing nothing at all, which was either reassuring or irrelevant depending on how you looked at it. He knocked on the door at the end of the corridor. There was a brief pause, the quality of which he could not quite interpret, and then the door opened. Rias Gremory stood in the doorway and looked at him. Behind her, the room was warm and lit with the late afternoon light coming through tall windows, and he could see the shapes of other people inside, and the room itself had the specific character of a space that had been inhabited with intention, full of books and a comfortable sofa and a chess set, and what appeared to be an extremely elaborate tea service. Kaneko said you might come, Rias said. Her expression was, as far as he could read it, carefully neutral in the way that covered something more uncertain. She suggested it. I thought it seemed worth taking her up on. He looked at her with open curiosity. I should probably say, before we go further, that I know what this club actually is. Or something close to it. I have some context for the kind of energy this building carries. She was very still for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, then. He came in. The room held 4 people. Kaneko was in an armchair by the window with a book open on her lap, looking at him with the flat assessment of someone who had already made their initial evaluation and was waiting to see if it held. Beside her, on the sofa, sat a young man with reddish-brown hair and an earnest, open face who looked up with a smile that was warm without being performed. This was Gasper, he would learn, and the smile was both the most natural thing about him and the most complicated. In the center of the room, at the chess table, a young woman with long dark hair and eyes the color of old amber looked up from the game she was apparently playing against herself with an expression of serene amusement that managed to take in both the chess board and the new arrival simultaneously. She was beautiful in the way that certain presences were beautiful, fully occupying the space they inhabited, comfortable with being looked at, carrying herself with the easy grace of someone who had made peace with her own nature a long time ago. This is Akino, Rias said, coming to stand beside her. My vice president. And you have apparently already met Kaneko. And this is Gasper. Hello, Issei said. He looked around the room without performing anything, simply taking it in with the genuine curiosity that was his most consistent feature. Akino tilted her head, studying him. You are not afraid, she said. It was not quite an accusation. More like a finding. Should I be? Most humans who enter this room sense something that makes them uncomfortable. Even before they know what it is. I grew up around very powerful things, he said. Power in itself doesn't make me uncomfortable. It's the character of the being that carries the power that matters. He looked at Rias. Your character, from what I have observed, seems worth engaging with rather than being afraid of. There was a silence in which all four of them were doing some version of reassessing. He waited it out with the patience he had learned from the cold of Niflheim and the long hours in Odin's study, the patience of someone who understood that good things arrived in their own time, and that pushing them rarely helped. Rias sat down in the chair opposite Aquino and looked at him with those extraordinary eyes. Sit down, Hyadukun. I think we need to have an honest conversation. He sat down, and the honest conversation began. Chapter 10, An Honest Conversation. You know what I am, Rias said. It was not a question. I know what category you belong to, Issei said. I know the broad outlines of how that works and why you are here. I don't know you specifically. Those are different things. Something in her expression shifted. He noticed it in the particular way he noticed things people revealed without intending to, a slight softening around the eyes, as if the distinction he had drawn mattered more to her than she would have expected. Where did you get this information? Aquino asked, from her chair. She was still watching him with that serene assessment, and he had the sense that she was considerably more alert beneath the serenity than the serenity suggested. From beings who have been observing the supernatural world for considerably longer than any of the current factions have existed, he said. I have been told about the three factions, the civil wars, the current cold peace. I have been told about the sacred gears. A pause. I have been told about the Longinus. The quality of the room's attention changed. Specifically, Kaneko said from her armchair, not looking up from her book, you have been told about yours. Yes. Now the room was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sky was doing something extraordinary with its light, turning the cloud cover apricot and gold, and the quality of the silence inside was the kind that accumulated around important things. Rias was looking at him with an expression that had moved past careful neutrality into something more openly wondering. You carry a Longinus, she said. I carry the boosted gear, he said. Or it carries me. I am still working out which direction is more accurate. You don't seem frightened of it, Gasper said. He had been quiet until now, and his voice was soft, with a quality of earnestness that was entirely genuine and entirely endearing. Most people who know they carry a Longinus are either terrified or obsessed with it. You sound like you are describing the weather. That is because I have spent several years being prepared rather than alarmed, Issei said. Being alarmed does not make you more capable of handling a thing. It just makes you louder while you are unable to handle it. Aquino made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. He has a point. Rias folded her hands on her knees in a gesture that he recognized as one she made when she was organizing her thoughts, which was itself a useful thing to know about a person. What do you want, Hyadukun? You came here. You told us what you know. What are you looking for from this conversation? He thought about the question with the care it deserved, because Rias Gremory had asked it with the directness of someone who was used to conversations where people said things that were adjacent to what they meant rather than the thing itself, and she clearly preferred the thing itself. Understanding, he said. Not alliance, not protection, not anything strategic. I came here because this city is clearly the place where whatever comes next is going to happen, and I do not think it serves anyone, including your club, for me to navigate that without knowing the people who are going to be part of it. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking for the conversation where trust can be decided on its actual merits. A pause. And, he added, because Kaneko invited me. And she does not seem like someone who does things without a reason. Kaneko, without looking up from her book, said correct. Rias studied him for a long moment. Then she unfolded her hands and reached for the tea service on the table beside her with the ease of someone making a decision and acting on it simultaneously. Tea, she said. And then we will talk. Properly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I have a great many questions and I expect honest answers. Those I can give you, he said. Within the limits of what I know, which I will be clear about. Aquino was smiling now, fully rather than adjacently. I like him, she said to the room generally. You like everyone, Kaneko said. I like interesting people, Aquino corrected pleasantly. The category is more specific than you give it credit for. The tea was poured, and the questions began, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor of the old building's second-floor room as the Occult Research Club and Issei Hayato began the long, careful work of learning each other. The questions Rias asked were good ones. He had expected interrogation about his capabilities, his intentions, his value to whatever supernatural calculation she was running. What he got instead was something more interesting. She wanted to understand how he thought. She asked him what he had been told about the Devil faction's history, and when he told her, she corrected 3 specific errors in his information with a precision that suggested she had strong feelings about historical accuracy. She asked him what he thought the relationship between power and responsibility looked like, which was a more philosophical question than he had anticipated, and he told her what Odin had taught him about it, without attributing it to Odin, and she listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who was actually engaging rather than simply gathering data. She asked him, at one point, what he was afraid of. Genuinely? He said, yes. Failing the people I care about. Not in battle. In the ways that matter more. Being someone they trusted who turned out not to deserve it. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird passed the window and was gone. That is not the answer I expected, Rias said. What did you expect? Something about the boosted gear. About power. About the factions. Those things have their own weight, he said. But they are problems. Problems can be worked on. The fear of failing someone who trusted you is different. It is a fear about your own character. Those are harder to resolve, because you cannot train your way past them or think your way around them. You simply have to be the person you are and hope it is good enough. Rias was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something layered and thoughtful that moved below the composed surface she presented to the world. And who raised you to think this way? He smiled. People who cared very much about doing things right. Who thought that getting the person right was more important than getting the power right, because the power follows the person eventually. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate, and picked up her tea. All right, Hyade-kun, she said. I don't know yet what role you will play in what is coming. I don't know if we will be allies or something more complicated than that. But I think this conversation was the right one to have. So do I. Come back tomorrow, if you want. There are books here that I suspect you will find interesting. And there are things about Koa's situation that you should know if you are going to be living here and if what is inside your left arm is going to eventually wake up properly. He looked at her. You know the boosted gear's location. I recognized it the first time I saw you in the courtyard, she said, with a directness that was itself a form of trust. Sacred gears leave a signature. The Longinus leave a signature that is considerably harder to miss. You said nothing. I was waiting to understand what kind of person you were. Power without character is a liability. I needed to know the character first. He looked at her for a moment. This crimson-haired devil who ran a club in an old building and read books in empty courtyards in the early morning and asked philosophical questions in between precise historical corrections. And he thought about the world tree, and the way everything connected to everything else in ways you could not see from where you were standing. Until tomorrow, then, he said. Until tomorrow. He left the old building in the last of the afternoon light. The city of Ko moved around him in its ordinary way, students and shopkeepers and a woman walking a dog of extraordinary size and a pair of children arguing about something with the complete commitment that only children brought to arguments, and the energy of the place hummed underneath all of it like a current in a river, invisible and constant. Issei walked home with his hands in his pockets, and the feeling of something beginning, exact and unmistakable, like the first note of a piece of music that would turn out to be longer and more beautiful and more complicated than anyone in the room had expected. Chapter 11, What Kaneko Knows. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It was not a formal arrangement. Nobody set a schedule, or issued an invitation, or established rules. It was more the way certain things became true through repetition. Issei arrived at the old building after school, and the room was open, and the people inside were doing what they did, and there was space for him there without anyone having made a particular point of creating it. The afternoons had a particular quality. Rias often worked at the large desk in the corner, and the work she did there was clearly club business of a practical nature, correspondence and arrangements, and what appeared to be, on closer inspection, the actual management of a small supernatural territory, which required the same combination of administrative thoroughness and strategic thinking as running any other kind of organization. Aquino drifted between helping Rias and sitting in comfortable conversation and making tea, the latter of which she did with a ceremonial attention that suggested she considered it genuinely important. Gasper read, with the specific absorption of someone for whom reading was not a leisure activity but a form of processing the world. Kaneko ate various small snacks with an expression of peaceful concentration, and Issei, who had grown up in a hall full of gods going about their various occupations and who found the presence of people doing things they cared about to be one of the most comfortable possible environments, read the books that he found on the shelves, which were extraordinary in ways he had not anticipated. "You have the entire recorded history of the underworld's noble families," he said one afternoon, looking at the spine of a leather-bound volume that was approximately the size and weight of a small child. "We are a noble family," Rias said, without looking up from her work. "You have 3 different accounts of the Great War. None of them agree. That is because all 3 were written by different factions, each of whom believes their account is the definitive one. Which one is actually closest to accurate?" Now she looked up. "What do you know about the Great War?" He told her what he knew, which was a version assembled from Odin's accounts, which were as close to neutral as accounts got because Odin had been watching from outside all 3 factions and had the perspective of extreme age. She listened carefully and corrected 7 things and confirmed 11 things and told him 2 things he had not been told before, with the manner of someone who had decided that if they were going to have this person in their space they might as well make it educational. It was during these afternoons that he began to understand each of them more specifically. Aquino, he discovered, was warmth on the surface over something considerably more complicated beneath, and the warmth was genuine rather than performed, which made the complications more interesting rather than less. She had a habit of watching conversations from a slight angle, as if she were studying them rather than simply participating, and when she laughed it was always because something was actually funny rather than because laughing was expected. Gasper was earnest in the way that only people who have worked hard for that earnestness could be earnest. It was not native to him, or not entirely, it had been chosen and held on to. He was also considerably more perceptive than his open face suggested, and he had a habit of noticing things about the emotional weather of a room that other people missed. Kaneko, who had been the one to bring him here, remained in some ways the most opaque, but Issei had been raised by Loki, who was the god of misdirection, and he had learned to read the shape of what was not said as readily as the shape of what was. What he read in Kaneko was precision, care, wariness that had been earned through experience rather than born from temperament, and underneath all of that, something that was working very hard to decide whether it was safe to be at ease. He did not push any of these observations. He simply held them, the way you held any useful information, and let the days accumulate. Kaneko spoke to him alone for the second time on a Thursday afternoon when Rias and Aquino had stepped out on what was described as club business and Gasper had fallen asleep over his book in the way that Gasper occasionally did, with the immediate and total commitment of someone whose relationship with consciousness was slightly more negotiable than most. "You have something old," Kaneko said. She was sitting across from him at the small table, her golden eyes flat and direct. "Older than the boosted gear. Something that has been near you since before you were born." He looked at her carefully. "What are you?" "Half Nikomata," she said. "I feel things. Energy textures. Histories that objects and people carry." A pause. "You carry something extraordinarily old. I felt it the day you arrived. I thought at first it was the boosted gear. But the gear is inside you. This other thing is on you." He reached into his shirt and brought out the pendant. The small piece of Yggdrasil root, dark and smooth, carved to no particular shape, smaller than his thumbnail. Kaneko looked at it. She did not reach for it. She sat very still, and something in her expression changed in a way that was too subtle for most people to catch but that Issei, who had been trained to watch for exactly this kind of subtle change, caught immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Her voice was the same flat murmur, but it had a different weight now. "A gift," he said. "From the person who raised me. Something of hers for me to carry." "The person who raised you was very ancient." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The beings who are described in the old texts as predating the current faction structure. The ones who observe from outside and are rarely directly involved. That is an accurate description, he said carefully. And you were raised by one of them. By several of them. The silence was long and thoughtful. Outside the window, a pair of birds moved across the evening sky in a wide arc, turned together, and were gone. That explains the no fear thing, Kaneko said at last. He smiled. Does it change anything? About my being here. She thought about it with the seriousness she gave everything. No. You came in good faith. That is the thing that matters. A pause. I will tell Riasbuchu eventually. She should know. I was going to tell her myself, when the time felt right. But I appreciate you being direct with me about it. Kaneko looked at him for a moment. You are not what I expected, she said. I expected someone who was trying to figure out what to do with the thing inside him. You already know. You have been preparing for a long time. Yes. That is good. She picked up her book again. It means the time you spend here can go toward other things. Toward the people, and what they need, rather than toward your own uncertainty. He looked at her. This small, precise, perceptive person who watched the world with golden eyes and spoke rarely and meant every word she said. Thank you, Kaneko, he said. She turned a page. Don't thank me. You would have figured it out yourself, probably. But it is faster this way. She made a small sound that was, he was fairly certain, the quietest possible version of agreement. Chapter 12, The Weight of Crimson. He found her in the courtyard again, 3 weeks into the semester. Early morning, the same time, the same corner near the wisteria that had come fully into bloom now and was doing extraordinary things with the morning light. But this time she was not simply standing. She was sitting on the low wall with her knees drawn up slightly, her crimson hair loose rather than in its usual perfect arrangement, and she was looking at something in the middle distance with the expression of a person who is having a conversation with themselves that is not going particularly well. Issei almost left. He had been raised by people who understood the value of a person's private hour, and he recognized this as one. But she looked up before he could withdraw, and the thing he saw in her eyes in that first unguarded moment was not loneliness wearing composure. It was just loneliness, direct and uncovered, the way things looked in the morning before a person had assembled the day around themselves. He sat down on the wall a comfortable distance from her, without asking, because asking would have given her the opportunity to say no in a polite way that she would have felt obligated to take. You do not have to talk, he said. I like the morning. I can just be here. She looked at him for a moment with those extraordinary eyes. Then she looked back at the middle distance. They sat in silence for a while. The wisteria moved in a light breeze. A bird sang something complicated in a nearby tree and then stopped, as if it had made its point. There are people who want things from me, Rias said eventually. Not as the opening of a conversation, more as a thought that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for long enough that it needed somewhere to go. From my family name. From my position. From what I represent. Yes, he said. Not a platitude. An acknowledgement. It is difficult, she said, to know what any given interaction is actually about. Whether the person in front of you is engaging with you, or with the idea of you. I imagine it has been like that for a long time, since I was old enough to understand what my family name meant to the people who heard it. He thought about this. About what it meant to be someone whose significance arrived before you did in every room you entered, who had to work backwards from the idea to the person in every interaction. I do not know your family name in the sense that matters to whoever uses it as a reason to want things, he said. I know your name because you are the person who handed me a book in a library and corrected my history and asked me what I was afraid of and poured tea with the specific intention of starting an honest conversation. That is the person I am interested in. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Warmer. She was looking at the wisteria, but her posture had shifted, something fractionally less defended about the set of her shoulders. You are unusual, she said. I have been told. I think it is a compliment, mostly. It is. A pause. The people who raised you. Were they good to you? Yes. Unconditionally. And did they want things from you? He thought about it. About Odin and the preparation, about what he had been shaped toward. They had hopes for me, he said carefully. But they were hopes about who I would be, not what I would do for them. They wanted me to become myself, as thoroughly as possible. Everything they gave me was toward that. She was quiet for a long moment. The morning light moved across the courtyard. That sounds, she said, and something in her voice was very precise and very honest, like something worth missing, if you are away from it. It is, he said. I miss them. Every day. But they are the reason I can be here, and that matters more than missing them feels bad. She looked at him. Full on, direct, with none of the social calculation that usually accompanied the way she engaged with people. Just her, looking at him, in the morning light. I am glad you are in Hyadukun, she said. It was a simple statement, delivered without drama, and because she was someone who chose her words with care, the simplicity of it was itself a thing of weight. He felt something in his own chest settle, the way stones settled in Frigga's garden when the season changed and the ground found its new configuration. Something that had been slightly provisional became, in that moment, simply true. So am I, he said. They sat together until the bell rang, and the morning ended, and Academy assembled itself around them for another ordinary extraordinary day. He wrote to Frigga that evening. He wrote to her regularly, in the form of long letters that he folded carefully and addressed to an arrangement Odin had established that would carry written communication across the 9 realms without the letter itself appearing to do anything more unusual than disappear from his hand. The replies arrived on his windowsill, always at dawn, in Frigga's rounded handwriting, and he kept all of them in the desk drawer. He told her about Rias. Not the supernatural dimension, she already knew the broad context. He told her about the courtyard, and the library, and the honest conversation over tea, and the morning by the wisteria. He told her what he had said, that he was engaged with the person, not the idea of the person. And that he meant it. He told her about Kaneko, the golden-eyed half-Nicomeda who had felt the age of the Yggdrasil pendant, and asked him direct questions without apology, and told him that his preparation meant his time here could go toward other things. He told her about Aquino and Gasper, about Matsuda and Motohama, about the algebra class and the history teacher who had an astonishing mustache and the ramen shop 2 streets from his apartment that had, in his considered opinion, figured out something about broth that other ramen shops had not. He told her he was well. That he missed the smell of the garden. That the cherry blossoms had mostly finished now but that Ko was beautiful in the way of a place that took its seasons seriously. He folded the letter and held it for a moment before he let it go. And in the moment before it disappeared he felt the pendant warm against his chest and the mark on his left arm hum with a warmth that was not quite physical and not quite sound but was both simultaneously. He went to the window and looked out at Ko in the night, the lights of the city arranged below him in their ordinary human configuration, and underneath the ordinary city the not-so-ordinary city with its currents of supernatural energy, and its careful devils and its old building full of people who were becoming, slowly and imperfectly, and in the way that the best things became, important to him. Something was coming. He had known since Odin had told him about Ko. Something large and complicated and necessary. He stood at the window and let himself feel the size of it, the way he had stood at the roots of Yggdrasil and let himself feel the size of that. Not with fear. With the specific quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Then he went to bed, because the morning would come and the morning would have its own requirements. And a person who did not sleep was a less useful person than one who did. Odin had taught him that too. In the hall of Asgard, a very long way away through the pathways between worlds, 2 ravens shifted on their perch above an empty doorway and watched the dark between the stars with their old, deep eyes. He is doing well, said Hugin. He is doing exactly as expected, said Munin. And rather better. The stars moved overhead in their patient courses, and the world tree breathed in its incomprehensible way, and the roots that connected everything to everything else continued their quiet and invisible work. Act 3. When the world stops watching. Chapter 13. The Fallen. The first fallen angel arrived on a Wednesday. Issei knew about fallen angels the way he knew about most things in the supernatural world, through careful instruction, through texts that were older than most living institutions, and through the specific perspective of someone who had been raised by beings who observed all factions from a distance long enough to see patterns that participants could not. Fallen angels were not simply angels who had sinned, though that was part of it. They were something more specific and more complicated, beings of considerable power who had chosen or stumbled into a state of permanent exile from the divine order they had belonged to, and who dealt with that exile in ways that varied, as any large group of people dealing with the same wound dealt with it, enormously. Some were bitter. Some were indifferent. Some had made peace with it in ways that were genuinely admirable, and some had made peace with it in ways that were deeply concerning to anyone who lived in the same world as them. The one who arrived in Ko on that Wednesday was not, from the moment Issei became aware of her presence, in the admirable category. He felt her arrive the way he felt the city's supernatural current, not through any formal sense but through the awareness that had been developing since his first day in Ko, sharpened by weeks of sitting in the old building with beings who carried their own specific energies and who had, through their simple proximity, helped him calibrate his perception of the supernatural spectrum more finely. The Fallen's energy was cold in a way that was distinct from the cold of Niflheim, which was simple and absolute. This was cold with intention in it, cold that had been chosen or accumulated through a long series of choices. He noted her presence and said nothing, because noting a thing and acting on it were different decisions, and the second required more information than he currently had. What he did instead was go to the old building after school and tell Rias. She was already aware. "Rainier," she said. She was standing at the window with her arms folded, looking out at the city with the expression she wore when something required management. "We have known she was operating in the area for the past week. She is not here for the territory. Fallen angels rarely are, in my experience. They are here for something specific." "A sacred gear," Issei said. She turned from the window. Her eyes moved to his left arm and then back to his face, the gesture so quick and precise that it would have been invisible to anyone less attentive. "We do not know yet whether she has identified you specifically. It is possible she is here on other business entirely, and if she has identified me specifically, then the situation becomes considerably more complicated and considerably more urgent." She sat down in her chair with the movement of someone organizing themselves to think clearly rather than sitting for comfort. "I want you to be careful. Vary your routes home. Do not go anywhere isolated in the evening without telling someone first. You are giving me the same instructions you would give any civilian who stumbled into a territorial situation," he said. "Not with offense. With observation." She looked at him. "You are a civilian, Hyadukun. Whatever is inside your left arm, it has not fully activated. In a direct encounter with a fallen angel of Rainier's level you would be at a significant disadvantage." "I am aware," he said. "I am not planning to seek a direct encounter. I am planning to be sensible about my routes home and to tell you where I am going. I am simply noting that I am not as undefended as the category of civilian might imply." "What do you mean?" He considered how much to say. He had been working toward telling her the full truth about his background for weeks, waiting for the right moment in the way that Odin had taught him patience worked, not as delay but as readiness. "I have been trained by people who take combat very seriously," he said. "Not to the level where I would seek a confrontation with a fallen angel of significant power. But not at zero either. I know how to move. I know how to avoid. I know how to assess a situation and find the options that are not obvious from the outside." Rias studied him. The afternoon light came through the window behind her and turned her crimson hair to something warmer than red. "I am beginning to think," she said slowly, "that your time in Norway was considerably less ordinary than your school records suggest." "Yes," he said. It was. A pause. "Will you tell me, eventually?" "Yes. When the moment is right. I promise you that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the slow deliberate nod that meant she had filed something as decided and was moving on. "Be careful, Hyadukun." "I will." He stood to leave. "And Grimora-senpai." "Yes?" "Thank you for telling me directly rather than trying to manage the situation without my knowledge. It matters." She looked at him with that layered expression that lived below her composed surface. "You would have found out regardless. It seemed more respectful to tell you." He left the old building into a city that felt, now, subtly differently weighted. Not more dangerous. More present. The way a landscape looks different when you know there is weather coming, the same landscape, more itself. Chapter 14. What Aquino taught him about reading rooms. The week that followed Rainer's arrival had a quality of held breath. The supernatural community of Ko, which Issei was gradually learning, operated with the combination of careful structure and barely contained tension that characterized any small community under external pressure, adjusted its rhythms. Rias spent more time at her desk in the evenings. Aquino's usual serenity developed a slightly finer edge beneath it. Kaneko, who had always been watchful, became more specifically watchful in a way that manifested as her golden eyes moving to the windows and doors of a room more frequently than usual. Gasper stayed closer to the old building and read more. He had a way of retreating into books when the world became pressured that was, Issei had concluded, not avoidance but a method of staying calm, keeping himself in a state where his abilities remained under his own management rather than slipping sideways under the influence of anxiety. Issei varied his routes, checked in with Rias at the end of each school day, and used the time to understand the people around him more thoroughly. This was not a strategy so much as his natural response to a situation with a lot of variables. Gather information, understand the specific shape of what you are working with, and let the clearer picture tell you what needs doing. It was Aquino who sat with him one afternoon when Rias was in a meeting with her brother that had apparently come with very little notice, and had driven everyone else temporarily out of the main room. They were in the smaller anteroom with its single window and the bookshelf that had been crammed with volumes in no discernible order, and Aquino was making tea with the ceremonial attention she always brought to it, and Issei was watching her with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he was trying to understand more precisely. "You have been watching me for 3 weeks," she said, without looking up from the tea. "I watch everyone," he said. "It is not surveillance. It is interest. I know the difference." She poured the tea into 2 cups with the same care a craftsman gave to finishing a piece of work. "What have you concluded?" He thought about whether to answer directly. He decided on directly, because Aquino was someone who asked direct questions because she wanted direct answers, and giving her anything else would be a failure of respect. "That you are the most perceptive person in this club," he said. "Including Rias, who is exceptional, and Kaneko, who feels things I cannot." "You read people. Not their energy, the way Kaneko reads mine. You read the way they inhabit themselves. The distance between who they are presenting and who they actually are." She placed the cup in front of him and sat across from him with her own cup and looked at him with those amber eyes that were, he had decided, the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to have made very deliberate choices about how to engage with it. "That is accurate," she said. "What else?" "That the serenity is genuine, not performed. But it is the serenity of someone who has worked very hard to arrive at it, not the serenity of someone for whom calm is simply the native condition. There is something underneath it that was not calm, once. And the serenity is partly a way of holding that something in a place where it cannot cause harm." The room was quiet. Outside, a cloud moved across the afternoon sun and the light in the small room changed. "You are also accurate about that," she said. Her voice was the same pleasant warmth it always was. But she was looking at him with a directness that the serenity did not usually allow through. "You are not going to ask about it?" "No. You will tell me when it is something you want to have told. That is your decision, not mine." She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was a different smile from the usual one, less performance and more actual warmth. "You are," she said, "a very unusual person, Hyadukan. So I have been told. The people who raised you. They were good at this. At making space for people without requiring them to fill it on a schedule. They were good at most things. Being patient with other people's timing was one of the ones I tried hardest to learn, because it does not come naturally to me. I am curious by inclination. Patience requires active work." She laughed. It was the real kind, unguarded and warm, and it changed the room slightly the way genuine laughter always did. "I would not have guessed the impatience. I have had very good teachers. The impatience is still there. It is just trained. I will remember that," she said. "It is useful information." "Why?" "Because it tells me that when you are being patient with someone, it is a deliberate act of care. Not the absence of urgency. The presence of it managed." She sipped her tea. "That is worth knowing about a person." He looked at her across the small table with the afternoon light doing its complicated things to the room around them, and he thought that whatever had happened to Akino Himejima before she became the serene and perceptive person who sat across from him now, it had not taken anything essential from her. The essential things were all present: the warmth, the intelligence, the specific quality of care she brought to the people around her. Whatever the story under the serenity was, it had produced someone worth knowing. That, he thought, was the most important conclusion. Rainier moved on a Friday evening, not against Issei. Not yet. She moved against a different target, a young woman named Yuma who had been, it turned out, a fallen angel in disguise engaging in the classic intelligence-gathering approach of becoming romantically involved with a sacred gear holder to assess their level of development. The sacred gear holder in question was not Issei. It was a third-year student named Takahashi who had never, as far as anyone could tell, been aware that anything unusual was happening in his life, and who came to school on Monday with an expression that Motohama described as someone who had looked through a window they had not known was there and found the view unexpectedly enormous. Issei heard the account secondhand, from Kaneko, who described it with her characteristic economy. A light spear, employed quickly, the sacred gear extracted and the holder left alive, which was, apparently, a form of restraint that suggested Rainier was either following orders or calculating that leaving a trail of obvious damage would draw more attention than she wanted. He sat with this information for a while. The old building was quiet around him. Outside, the evening was doing something beautiful and indifferent with the last of the daylight. "She is calibrating," he said to Kaneko. "Yes. She extracted a gear from someone she had assessed as low development. She is working her way up a list. That is Riasbuch's assessment also. Which means the list has my name on it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The mark on his left arm was doing nothing, which was either meaningless or reassuring depending on how you felt about it. He had decided to find it reassuring. "What is Rias planning?" "She is deciding between two approaches," Kaneko said. "Intervening directly to remove Rainier from the territory, or waiting and using the situation to better understand what the fallen angels are actually after. The second option requires putting me at some level of risk." "Yes." "Which is why she has not made the decision yet." He thought about this. About the decision Rias was sitting with, alone in her office, trying to balance strategic advantage against the safety of a specific person. He thought about what Odin had taught him regarding decisions that involved other people's well-being, that the mark of a good leader was not finding a calculation that eliminated risk, but being honest about the risk and asking the person who carried it what they thought. "I will go talk to her," he said. Kaneko looked at him. "She did not ask for your input." "No. But she should have mine anyway." He stood. "The person whose safety is the variable in the calculation deserves a voice in the calculation. That is not a debate, it is just correct." Kaneko watched him walk toward the office with those flat, golden, assessing eyes. After he had gone, she looked back at her book. "Correct," she said quietly, "to no one in particular." Chapter 15. The person whose safety is the variable. He knocked on the office door. "Come in." The office was the innermost room of the old building's second floor, smaller than the main club room and more personally inhabited. There were notes pinned to a board on one wall and a large map of Ko with markings he recognized as territorial notation and a photograph on the desk that he had never looked at closely enough to identify, and several stacks of books that were clearly in active use rather than shelved for reference. Rias was at her desk. She looked up when he entered and something in her expression moved through surprise to something more guarded before settling into the careful neutrality she defaulted to when she was not sure what was coming. "Hayadakun. I know you are making a decision," he said. He came and sat in the chair across from her desk, the direct approach, because anything more circumspect would have wasted both of their time. "I know one of the options involves allowing Rainier to approach me as a way of gathering intelligence about her mission. And I know you have not told me this because you are uncomfortable with the idea of using my situation as a strategic variable." She was very still. "I am not here to tell you what to decide," he continued. "I am here to tell you that I should have a voice in it. Because whatever risk attaches to that option, it is mine to decide whether to accept. Not yours to carry on my behalf." The silence that followed was long and had a particular texture. She was looking at him with an expression that he was coming to recognize as the one she wore when something had arrived at her from a direction she had not been watching. Most people, she said finally, who are told they may be the target of a fallen angel ask what I am going to do to protect them. They do not ask for a voice in the strategy. I am not most people. And you already know that. Yes. She folded her hands on the desk. What do you think? I think the intelligence option is probably the right one, strategically. If Rainier is working from a list, knowing her full mission before we remove her is valuable. If we remove her without knowing what she was sent here to find, whoever sent her will simply send someone else with the same objective, and we will have no information advantage. And you are willing to be in her range while we gather that intelligence. With conditions, he said. I am not willing to be in her range without your club's awareness of my location at all times. I am not willing to operate alone in that window. And I need to know what the exit looks like. What the signal is, what happens when we have enough and the containment moves to the active phase. She looked at him for a long moment. You sound like someone who has planned operations before. I have been educated by people who have. Concepts transfer. A pause that had a different quality than her usual pauses. Something in it that was not professional or strategic but personal, the kind of pause that happens when someone is adjusting to a version of another person that is more than they had previously accounted for. All right, she said. Your conditions are reasonable. I will tell you everything. And we will plan it together. Thank you. You do not need to thank me. You were right that you should have been included from the start. I was trying to protect you from an uncomfortable knowledge, and that was not my decision to make. He looked at her. The office light was warm and the evening had fully arrived outside the window, and the map on the wall with its territorial markings was the evidence of a person who took her responsibilities seriously enough to track them in physical space. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The photograph on your desk. Who is it? She glanced at it, and something crossed her face, brief and complex. My brother. And our household, in the underworld. It was taken when I was 12. You look happy in it. She looked at the photograph with the expression of someone navigating a feeling they have made peace with, but that peace is the ongoing work of a person rather than an accomplished fact. I was. Things were simpler then. The complications came later. Most complications do, he said. Not as comfort, as acknowledgement. The simplicity is not less real for having been complicated afterward. Both things are true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back at him, and whatever was in her expression was not the composed surface or the strategic assessment. It was simply her, looking at him. How do you know that? She asked. Because I was raised in a place that was the best thing I have ever known. And I had to leave it. And it did not stop being the best thing I have ever known just because I left. The office was quiet. Outside, Crow moved through its evening. We will plan tomorrow, she said finally. Tonight, go home and sleep. You will need to be clear-headed for this. Agreed. He stood. At the door, he turned back. Grimoire-senpai. Yes. Whatever is coming. We will handle it. Not because I am particularly confident about fallen angels. Because you are very good at this, and the people in your club are extraordinary, and I tend to trust good people working at their best. She looked at him with those extraordinary eyes for a moment, that was slightly longer than it needed to be. Good night, Hayato-kun, she said. Good night. Chapter 16, Rainier. She found him, as he had expected, on a Tuesday evening. He had been walking a route that was, by design, slightly more isolated than his usual ones, not a trap, but an invitation, the difference being that a trap was designed to eliminate the target's agency while an invitation simply made it easier for the person to choose to arrive. Rainier had been watching him for 4 days, which he knew because Kaneko had confirmed it, and because he had felt the specific quality of her attention in the way you felt eyes on the back of your neck in an empty corridor. He had the pendant warm against his chest and his senses at their most open, and Aquino positioned 3 blocks north, and Kaneko 2 blocks south, and Rias on standby with a response time they had measured twice during planning. He was as prepared as preparation allowed. She descended from above, which was the most natural approach for someone who could fly, and she landed on the path ahead of him with a grace that announced itself. She was beautiful in the way that some dangerous things were beautiful, formally, as if beauty had been arranged around her rather than grown from within her. She had dark hair and violet eyes and the specific way of holding herself that belonged to beings who had been powerful for a very long time. Her energy was cold. Up close it was colder than he had felt it from a distance, and it had edges that he had not detected from across the city, sharper and more intentional. Issei Hayadu, she said. Her voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was a tool, not a quality. Yes, he said. He stopped and looked at her and kept his hands loose at his sides and his posture neutral, which was what Sif had taught him. An open but unafraid position communicated. She tilted her head. He had expected, based on Rias's intelligence profile of her, some form of the approach she had used with Takahashi, the establishment of rapport, the gradual revelation, the emotional leverage. What he had not entirely anticipated was that his response to her arrival would cause her to recalibrate before she had even started. You don't seem surprised, she said. I am not. Most of the people I approach are surprised. I imagine so. He looked at her steadily. You have been watching me for 4 days. I was aware of your presence from the moment you arrived in Ko. I am not surprised that you have eventually chosen to make direct contact. Something shifted in her expression quickly, the movement of a calculation running new numbers. You can sense me. I can sense most things of your nature and power level, yes. That is unusual for a human, I have been told. He held her gaze. I know what you came to Ko for. I know what you did to Takahashi last Friday. I know roughly what your mission is, though not its specific purpose, which is the thing I am more interested in. She was still now, the stillness of something very powerful deciding whether a situation required a different approach than the one it had prepared. You know a great deal for a sacred gear holder who has not yet activated his gear. Yes. The devils told you. Some of it. The rest I gathered myself. You are not afraid. No. He said it simply, because simplicity was the most honest statement of a fact. Not of you specifically. I have met things considerably more powerful than a fallen angel of your level. I do not say that to diminish you. I say it because it is true and because I think you are someone who operates on accurate information, and I would rather give you accurate information than information that serves a performance. Raina looked at him for a long moment. The evening was fully dark now and her dark wings were visible at her back, the specific shade of something that had once been light and become something else. What do you want? She asked. Because she was, under the calculation and the cold, someone who asked direct questions. To know why, he said. Not the mission. The reason behind the mission. What your faction is actually trying to achieve by acquiring the Longinus in this region. A pause. And if I tell you, then I will consider the information carefully and decide what to do with it based on its actual content. I am not negotiating. I am asking. The night was quiet around them. A distant sound of traffic. The cool air moving through the city. Raina looked at him with her violet eyes, and in them he saw something that was not the calculation and not the cold, something much older and more complicated than either, the look of a being who had been in exile for a very long time and who occasionally, against their own intentions, encountered something that reminded them of what it felt like to be spoken to honestly. You are not what I expected, she said. I have been told that also. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, there is a faction within the fallen hierarchy that believes the current balance of power is unstable. That another conflict is coming regardless of whether anyone wants it. They want to build leverage before it arrives. By acquiring sacred gears. By acquiring specific Longinus. The boosted gear in particular. The sacred gear of the Red Dragon Emperor is the only known item capable of matching the current level of escalation they are predicting. He thought about this carefully. It was more information than he had expected her to give him, and either it was genuine, or it was the more sophisticated form of misdirection, the kind that offered real information in order to establish credibility. He filed both possibilities without committing to either. And what would acquiring it accomplish? Extracting it from its host kills the host, or comes very close to it. A dead sacred gear is less useful than a living one. Some within that faction disagree with the extraction approach, she said. They believe the host, properly controlled, is more valuable than the isolated gear. Controlled how? She did not answer this one. But the not answering was itself information. Thank you, he said. For the honesty. She looked at him. I did not do it for you. I know. You did it because someone asking you honest questions in an honest way is rarer than it should be, and it produced an honest response. That is not a criticism. It is simply how honesty works sometimes. Rainier was still for a moment. Then she rose into the air with the terrible grace of something that had once belonged to the sky and never entirely stopped. You should know, she said from above him, that my mission does not change because of this conversation. I will be required to make another attempt. I know, he said, looking up at her against the night sky. When you do, I hope you choose the approach that leaves both of us standing afterward. I think that would be better for both of us. She looked down at him for one long moment. Then she was gone, rising into the darkness above the city, and the cold of her presence receded and settled back into its ordinary nighttime self. Issei stood on the path for a moment. Then he took out the small communication token Rias had given him and sent the signal that meant, I am safe and I have information. The response came back in 11 seconds. He had timed this. It was a very fast 11 seconds. Chapter 17. After the Dark. Rias's response to his account of the conversation with Rainier was everything he had come to expect from her. She listened to the entire thing without interrupting, asked 4 specific questions at the end, each one more precisely aimed than the last, and then sat in silence for 3 full minutes while she thought. The club room had the particular quality of late evening, the light warmer and more specific than the afternoon versions, everyone present and alert in the way that serious situations made people alert. Kaneko sat with her feet tucked under her. Aquino stood near the window. Gasper had his hands folded on the table in front of him in a way that suggested he was using the gesture to keep himself grounded. A faction within the fallen hierarchy, Rias said finally. Not the leadership. That was my read. She distinguished between the faction and the broader organization, which means it is not a declared operation. They are acting on their own authority, which means if we remove Rainier, the faction will know they have been identified, Aquino said from the window. She was not looking at them but at the city outside. And they will either escalate or go quiet, and we will not know which until one of those things happens. Correct, Rias said. The calculus has changed. She looked at Issei. You gave her nothing. I asked questions and listened. I confirmed that I was aware of her presence and her mission, because she needed accurate information to make good decisions, and I thought a fallen angel making better decisions was marginally safer than one operating on false assumptions. You were trying to give her reasons to choose the less harmful path, Gasper said quietly. Yes. Did it work? I don't know yet. She told me her mission did not change. I told her I hoped she would choose the approach that left both of us standing. Whether that landed, I cannot say. It may not have, Rias said. She was not being harsh, simply precise. Rainier is not irrational. But she is operating under orders from a faction, and factions have their own gravity. Personal preference does not always outweigh institutional pressure. I know, Issei said. I was not counting on it. I was investing in a possibility. That is different from a plan. Rias looked at him. Then she did something she did not do often. She smiled, small and genuine, the kind that arrived without being assembled. You invested in a possibility while also gathering intelligence. That is not bad work for someone who has not activated his Longinus. I had excellent teachers, so you keep saying. I remain curious about them. You will meet them eventually, he said. I am fairly confident of that. Something in her expression shifted at that. Not surprise exactly, more like the updating of a probability. You expect them to come here. I expect that when things become sufficiently interesting, they will find it difficult to simply watch. He said it with the fondness of someone who knew the people in question very specifically. They are invested. They will present it as observation. It will be something warmer than that. Aquino turned from the window. The Norse Pantheon, she said. The room became very still. Issei looked at her. She was looking back at him with those amber eyes, and in them was the specific expression of someone who has assembled a puzzle and is looking at the complete picture for the first time. You recognize the pendant, he said. I recognize the material. There is very little Yggdrasil root in circulation. The amount that exists outside of Asgard itself could be counted on one hand. She paused. And I recognize the energy signature you carry. I have been in the presence of beings who carry the mark of a Norse divine household. It is distinctive. When were you going to tell me? Rias asked. She was looking at Aquino, but the question had a direction that included the entire room. When he was ready to tell you himself, Aquino said simply. He has been working toward it. I did not want to take the moment from him. Rias looked at Issei. He met her gaze steadily. The people who raised me, he said, are the Norse gods. Specifically, Odin Allfather, who found me and decided I was worth keeping. Frigga, who raised me as a son. Thor, Sif, Loki, and the household of Asgard. I am, as far as anyone can determine, human by biology. But I have been educated, shaped, and prepared by the Norse Pantheon since infancy. The silence that followed was the kind that you could not measure in seconds because it existed at a different scale. Gasper made a small sound that was not quite any particular word. Kaneko, without looking up, said I knew the pendant was from someone important. Rias sat back in her chair slowly, looking at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, processing, recalibrating, and underneath both of those, something that was not suspicion or alarm but a kind of wondering that she had not entirely expected to feel. You were going to tell me, she said. Not a question. Yes. I promise you I would. The moment felt right. Or rather, he amended, with a slight smile, Aquino made it feel right, which is essentially the same thing. Why did Odin choose you specifically? He says the stars moved. He says fate had arranged it before he arrived. I believe him, because he is not a person who explains things in terms larger than the terms warrant. If he said the stars moved, they moved. And the boosted gear. He knew about it. From the first night. He raised me to be someone who could carry it without being consumed by it. 16 years of preparation for the conversation we are having now and whatever comes after it. Rias folded her hands on the table and looked at him with a steadiness that was its own form of respect. I have been wondering since the library who you actually were. The person in front of me has always been more than the surface. I simply did not know the dimensions of the more. Now you do. Now I do. A pause. Does this change how you see your position here? In this club, in this city, in relation to us? No, he said. I am still Issei Hayadu, transfer student, who came to Ko because something was waiting for him here. The household I come from is larger than I described. The preparation I have received is more comprehensive than I suggested. But none of that changes what I told you in our first honest conversation. I am here for the people. For the specific, actual people in this room. That is true regardless of where I come from. Rias looked at him for a long moment. Then Aquino, from the window, said I am going to make more tea. This seems like the appropriate response to the current situation. Gasper said, with complete sincerity. I think that is exactly right. And something in the room shifted, the way rooms shifted when the weight of a significant truth had been set down, and everyone had had a moment to look at it, and decide it was not, in the end, as destabilizing as the weight of carrying it had been. Kaneko, still without looking up, reached over and placed one of her small snacks on the table in front of Issei. It was, he recognized, an act of acceptance so understated as to be almost invisible, which was exactly how Kaneko expressed the things that mattered most to her. He ate the snack. The tea arrived. The evening continued. Chapter 18. The Dragon Stirs. He dreamed of red. Not blood red, not the red of violence. The red of something enormous and very old that breathed in rhythms longer than centuries. That had been awake for so long that the concept of sleep was a philosophical curiosity rather than a personal experience. It was the red of scales that caught light the way a cathedral window caught light, dispersing it into components that were individually more beautiful than the whole. He had been having this dream, in fragments, since he was 12. Since the night of the birthday, and the mark on his hand and the conversation in the firelit room. Each fragment added something, a texture, a sound, a sense of scale. But they had always been fragments, disconnected images that told him the presence was there without telling him its shape. This dream was different. In this dream, he was standing on a plane that did not exist in any realm he had visited, and the sky above it was the deep crimson of something that had never been blue, and in front of him was a presence so vast that the word enormous did not begin to account for it, like trying to describe the ocean with vocabulary developed for puddles. "You have been preparing," the presence said. The voice was not a voice in any ordinary sense. It was the reverberation of something that had once been a voice, distributed through the air around him the way sound distributed itself through water. "Yes," he said. He was not afraid. He was, if anything, more aware of himself than he usually was, as if the scale of what he was standing before had sharpened rather than diminished his own sense of his dimensions. The preparation was wise. Most of my hosts arrived to me without preparation. They were overwhelmed by the scale. You are not overwhelmed. Not yet. Ask me again when you are fully awake. Something in the vast presence shifted. It took him a moment to identify what he was feeling as the equivalent, scaled up to something incomprehensible, of amusement. "I like that," answered the presence said. The ones who were certain before they had been tested were always the ones who broke. The ones who acknowledged the possibility of being tested were the ones who sometimes did not. Sometimes is better than never. It is also honest. I have had dishonest hosts. I prefer honest ones. I have been told that about relationships generally. The amusement again. The Allfather taught you this? He and others. You know who raised me? I have been awake inside you since before you could speak. I know everything you know. I have simply been waiting to speak directly until you were ready to hear it. He thought about this. About the 16 years of the presence he had felt in the mark on his left arm, the warmth that was not quite physical, the sense of something listening that he had described to Frigga on the night of his birthday. "You have been watching me grow up," he said. "Yes. What did you think?" "I thought, this one might make it. This one has been given the tools and is using them in the right order." Another pause, enormous and warm. "I thought, this one remembers that people matter more than power, and that is the thing that has broken every other host who might otherwise have survived. Power without the anchor of care becomes its own kind of drowning." Issei stood on the impossible plane under the impossible sky and felt the size of what was being described and let himself feel it without trying to make it smaller. "I am not going to be able to use you in the way some of my hosts have," he said. "I am not built for conquest or for the kind of strength that proves itself by defeating other strong things." "I know. Is that a problem?" "No. It is, actually, a relief. My hosts who used me for conquest were very impressive and completely exhausting." The amusement was clear now, unmistakable. "You are going to use me for something more interesting. I am looking forward to it." "What do you want?" he asked. "You are a being of your own, in whatever form. What do you actually want from this?" The presence was quiet for a long moment. The crimson sky moved overhead in slow patterns. "To be used well," it said finally. "To be carried by someone who is worth being carried by. To watch something good happen through the power I represent, rather than simply watching the most spectacular version of what I can do." Another pause. "My name is Ddraig. I have been inside you since before your birth. I am glad, after 16 years of patience, to finally speak to you directly." "I am Issei," he said, which was both obvious and somehow necessary. "I know." Warmth. Enormous, ancient warmth. "I am glad to know you, partner." He woke before dawn with the mark on his left arm lit with a soft red glow that faded as he became fully conscious, leaving behind a warmth that was not quite physical and not quite sound but was both simultaneously. He lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the pre-dawn quiet of Ko. Then he got up and made tea and sat at his window and watched the city come slowly awake in the early light, and the warmth of the mark did not fade entirely, and the dream did not recede the way dreams receded. It remained, clear and enormous and entirely new, at the edge of his awareness. A partner. 16 years of preparation and a dragon who had been watching and waiting and had chosen, after all of that, to say, "I am glad to know you." He watched the light move across Ko and felt the specific completeness of a thing arriving at exactly the right time, and he let himself, quietly and without performing it for anyone, be glad. Chapter 19, What Sif Would Say. He told Rias about the dream the next morning. Not all of it. The conversation with Ddraig was something he wanted to hold for a little while longer, the way you held a letter you had been waiting for before sharing its contents, giving yourself the time to understand what it meant before explaining it to someone else. But he told her about the dream's quality, the clarity of it, the sense that something that had been at the edge of his awareness had moved to the center. The gear is waking, she said. She was standing in the courtyard, which had become, over the weeks, the place where they had conversations that were too important for the professional context of the old building and too significant for the improvised nature of a hallway. Not fully. But it is closer than it was. Does it feel different? Having spoken to it? To him, Issei said. He is very much a him. Something moved in her expression. You spoke to Ddraig. In the dream. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the attention that was one of the most consistent things about her. What is he like? He thought about how to describe something that was at the edge of the describable. Patient. Very old. Considerably more humorous than I expected. He has strong opinions about what makes a good host, and he communicated those opinions with the directness of someone who has been keeping them to himself for several thousand years and is relieved to finally have an appropriate audience. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family as one. He sounds exhausted by his predecessors. I think that is accurate, yes. And you? How do you feel? Different, he said. And then, because she asked in a way that deserved more than the single word, complete is not the right word. More like, the picture I have always been looking at has come into focus. I always knew something was there. Now I know its name, and its voice and its sense of humor. Ddraig is known for being one of the most powerful beings that has ever existed in this world, she said. His hosts have shaped history. Yes. That does not seem to be what you are primarily thinking about. No, he admitted. I am primarily thinking about what Sif would say. She tilted her head. Who is Sif? The one who taught me to fight. She has been training warriors for 800 years and she has very specific opinions about the difference between power and capability. She would tell me that knowing the name of the dragon inside my arm does not change my footwork, and that before I think about anything else I should go run the sparring sequences she taught me at 14 and make sure they are clean. Rias looked at him for a moment. Then she said, She sounds like someone I would like to meet. I think you would, he said. You are similar in the ways that matter. You both take your responsibilities seriously without letting seriousness become the only thing. You both ask the right questions rather than the easy ones. And you both have a specific look you give people who are underestimating the situation that communicates your assessment without requiring you to say it out loud. She was quiet for a moment. Do I have a look like that? Yes. It is quite effective. Something happened in her expression that was difficult to name, a softening that was not vulnerability. More like the specific kind of warmth that arrived when you discovered that someone had been watching you with enough genuine attention to notice the things you did not notice about yourself. You are, she said, and the words had more weight than their volume, genuinely unlike anyone I have met. Is that good? Yes, she said without hesitation. It is. The wisteria moved in a light breeze. The morning was making its ordinary beautiful arguments for being a good one. He did go and run the sparring sequences that afternoon. He found an empty section of the school's athletic field after everyone else had gone, and he went through the sequences that Sif had spent years building into his body's memory, the falling patterns, the reading patterns, the response sequences that did not require his head's permission because his body had learned to manage them independently. He had not sparred since arriving in Ko. There had been no appropriate partner, and no obvious reason to draw attention to his training by practicing in front of people who did not know his background. But he had maintained the sequences in his room in the morning, in the limited space available, the abbreviated versions. Now, with space, the full versions felt different. The mark on his left arm was warm throughout. Not intensely. Not in any way that interfered. But present, the way a good thought was present when you were doing something that required your whole attention, at the edge of awareness without demanding the center. He ran the sequences through twice. The second time was cleaner than the first, which was how it was supposed to work, the body learning the lesson the first pass taught. He finished and stood in the late afternoon light of the athletic field, breathing evenly, feeling the warmth of honest physical effort and the other warmth that lived in his left arm. Good footwork. He turned. Rias was standing at the edge of the field. She had come quietly, which for someone of her presence was an active choice. She was watching him with an expression of genuine assessment rather than simple observation, the expression of someone who understood what they were looking at. You followed me, he said. I was curious. I have been curious about what your training actually looks like for several weeks. You mention it. You describe it. But I had not seen it, and it is not what I expected from someone who has not been in a formal supernatural combat system. It is more like, she thought carefully, someone who has been taught by a person who understood fighting as a philosophy rather than a skill set. That is exactly what Sif is, he said. I can see it. The way you move is deliberate in a particular way. Not slow, the opposite of slow. But every movement is a decision rather than a reaction. That is very difficult to teach. She spent years teaching me that my body could make the small decisions so my mind could make the large ones. Rias walked to the edge of the field properly, and stopped a comfortable distance from him. The athletic field had the quality that empty outdoor spaces had in the late afternoon, open and specific at the same time. When the gear activates, she said, your style will look very different. I know. The doubling will change the physical parameters entirely. Are you ready for that? I have been preparing for it for 4 years. Whether I am ready is something I will know in the moment, and not before. He looked at her. Are you worried? Yes, she said. Simply and directly, because she had been practicing honesty since their first honest conversation, and it was becoming more natural. Not about the power. About what the process costs. Activation is not painless. I know. I have read accounts of it. So have I. Odin was very thorough about making sure I understood the full picture. And it does not change your readiness. Pain is temporary. What comes after it is the point. That is the thing Sif spent the longest time teaching me. Pain is information. Process the information and keep moving. Rias looked at him in the late afternoon light, and he could see her working through something, some internal negotiation between the strategic part of her that was calculating variables and the more personal part that was feeling something it did not fully have words for. When it happens, she said finally, I want to be there. I know. Not to manage it. Just to be there. I know, he said again, and the second time had a different weight than the first, the weight of understanding what she meant rather than simply its surface content. They walked back to the school building together in the settling evening, not talking, which between them had become a form of conversation in its own right. Chapter 20. The Second Attempt. Rainer came for him on a night that had given no warning. He had been walking back from the convenience store 2 blocks from his apartment, an errand so ordinary that it had the quality of an alibi, when he felt her energy overhead like a drop in temperature that was specific rather than seasonal. She descended faster this time. No landing on the path ahead, no announcement. She came down at speed and he moved before she had completed the descent, the body thinking that Sif had spent years installing a lateral step that took him outside the radius of her first strike. The spear of light hit the path where he had been standing. He looked at the mark on the ground and then looked up at her. She was hovering at shoulder height, wings extended, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who had prepared for one version of a situation and arrived to find a different version. You moved, she said? Yes. Most people cannot move that fast without supernatural enhancement. I have had very good training. She formed a second spear. He tracked the formation with the same attention he used to track the energy of a sparring partner, the specific precursor movements that indicated where an attack was being built. Rainer, he said. You told me last time that you preferred an accurate picture to comfortable assumptions. Let me give you one now. My left arm is carrying a Longinus that is currently in the early stages of activation. That process has been accelerating over the past week. If you push this to a direct confrontation tonight, you will be encountering the boosted gear at a level that is not yet stable, which is more dangerous for both of us than the stable version. You are trying to talk me out of it. I am giving you information. What you do with it is your decision. She held the second spear. He held his ground. The night was quiet around them, the ordinary nighttime sounds of Ko unreachable behind the specific silence of a moment that had its own weather. The mark on his left arm was not warm. It was hot. Not painfully. But with the urgency of something coming awake faster than its own schedule, pulled toward the surface by the proximity of genuine threat. He felt it the way you felt the tide, not the water yet, but the certainty of the water, the knowledge that the water was coming and that the question was not if but when and how much. You are genuinely not afraid, Raina said. Not the observation she had made during their first conversation. This was something else, something more specific. Wondering, almost. No. I have fought beings much more powerful than you who were afraid. The fear made them smaller. You are not smaller. Being smaller would not help me. It would just mean I was smaller, and still in the same situation. She was still for a moment. The second spear dissipated. She did not reform it. My faction, she said, and the words had a weight that was different from how she had said the word before, is going to send a replacement if I fail this mission. I know. The replacement will not have my particular approach. Also understood. So what you are actually asking me to do, she said, with the sharp intelligence that lived underneath her cold exterior, is consider whether my particular approach, which you have been trying to engage with, is more valuable to me than completing the mission. I am not asking you to do anything. I am being honest about the situation. What it asks of you is its own question. She looked at him. In the dim light of the street her violet eyes were very dark and very old. You are going to be a considerable problem for everyone, she said. For the factions. For the people who want to categorize you and use the category. You do not fit in any of the categories. I have never found that particularly troubling. No, she said, and something in her voice was not cold at all. You would not. She rose. Not the aggressive rise of her second approach, but the slower rise of something choosing its own terms. Go home, Issei Hayadu, she said. The gear that is waking inside you is going to need you rested for what comes next. Is that advice? A pause. Consider it information. What you do with it is your decision. He looked up at her against the night sky. What will you do? She was already high enough that her face was difficult to read. Something I have not decided yet. Which is, for me, an unusual position. Then she was gone, and the cold of her presence moved north with the dark, and Ko resumed its ordinary breathing. Issei stood on the path for a moment. The mark on his left arm was still hot, fading slowly to warm, like a coal moving from its brightest point back towards something sustainable. He picked up the convenience store bag, which had survived the encounter entirely intact, and walked home. He texted Rias, second contact. I am fine. Come to the club room tomorrow. I have a great deal to tell you. The response arrived before he reached his door. I will be there. Are you certain you are all right? It was not punctuated as a question. It was a statement looking for confirmation. He wrote back yes. Also, I think something important is about to happen. I wanted you to know before it does. 3 dots. Then I know. I have been watching the gear's energy signature for the past week. It is almost time. He put his phone in his pocket and unlocked his apartment door and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the city behind him, lights and ordinary lives and the invisible current of the supernatural world running underneath everything like a river you could only feel if you knew how to feel for it. The mark was warm. Ddraig was awake, not the dormant awareness of 16 years but something more active, something that had been roused by the encounter, and was now present in a way that was almost like a second heartbeat. Soon, Issei said quietly, to the warmth in his left arm. The warmth pulsed once. He went inside.